How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
Just a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
Or the one where it's like the stagecoach. They're waiting on the stagecoach in the Western, but it's actually like a theater director.
Like a stagecoach.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. That's good. I love it. I love a pun.
Hi ho, Gary Horde here.
Please do. Please.
Oh my God, please do your entire intro.
Welcome to Cinema Shock, the podcast exploring the stories behind your favorite cult and genre films. We do all the research so that you don't have to. This is the last podcast you'll ever need about Jimmy Henson. I'm one of your hosts, Gary Horde.
I love that I'm your other host, Justin Bishop, and I love that your Muppet voice has a lisp. It sounds like it also sounds a little bit like Bullwinkle the Moose.
He's just one of my characters, you know.
One of
gonna
many.
switch it up. I can't be Jim Henson and just use the Dr. Teeth voice for every character.
And I am writer-comedian Mr. Todd A. Davis. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of our coverage of Jim Henson's life and work leading up to his iconic films in our series we've titled Heartfelt, The Legacy of Jim Henson.
All right. So at the end of our last episode, Jim Henson had kind of entered a new era of his career. He had originally seen puppetry as a means to an end. Basically, it was his way of getting into the world of television production, which was a dream that he had had since childhood. And puppetry had treated him pretty well. With the creation of the Muppets, as well as Muppets Incorporated, which was the company that he co-founded with his wife, Jane, Jim had begun a very successful career in the world of television, both as a regular guest on national variety shows like The Tonight Show, as well as the creator of popular TV commercials. And he'd even achieved a degree of stardom when Ralph, which was a character that he'd created for a series of Purina dog food commercials, became a national sensation on The Jimmy Dean Show. So Jim had achieved what he had set out to do. He was working professionally in television and making a decent living doing it. But by this point in time, his dreams had grown. His vision had gotten bigger, and he no longer saw television as the end game. Jim Henson wanted to be a filmmaker, and he didn't know it at the time, but the winding road of Henson's career would soon lead him into two very different destinations: the Arthouse movie theater, as well as a little corner of the world called Sesame Street.
I did not realize, and I've gone back and watched clips from this Jimmy Dean stuff, but Ralph was big. He was bigger than Kermit, and even I think I may have mentioned that last time.
Most of them are bigger than Kermit. Kermit's like one of the smaller Muppets.
Are you talking about size-wise? Is this a joke?
Yes, yes, it is.
No, yeah, size-wise, yeah.
I don't know what's happening anymore. We've got it. This thing has warped us into such goofy territory. I don't know what these conversations are. I'm just saying Ralph was like a big, popular.
He was
character.
he was the most popular Muppet at that time. While Kermit was the standout character from the Sam and Friends days. He was kind of the one that became the star off of that show. Ralph, at the time of the Jimmy Dean Show, was definitely the most well-known Muppet in the world.
And also, I will say, I saw stuff with Jimmy Dean or read about Jimmy Dean talking about working with Ralph. I felt a little redeemed even hearing him talk about how real Ralph felt to everybody.
Yeah.
Just them interacting on the show. And he was saying, I know he's not real, but for some reason, he cracks me up. And when we're on stage, I feel like he's my buddy, and we're hanging out. And then they were talking about that the cue card guys would be, holding up the cue cards for Ralph, and the boom mic would go over Ralph's head. They were treating it as though Ralph was a real person up on stage. So I felt a little redeemed that my thought that the Muppets were a real race of people.
You're talking about when you were a child, not not now.
I can't remember if I told this last time. Jennifer and I were with another couple friend of ours, and we were having this discussion about Jim Henson. I was explaining, I at one point, like, I really did think Muppets were like a race of people. They're like, how old were you? And Jennifer's like 14.
43 years old. He just found out.
Hey, listen, and I know we'll get there eventually, but it's hard when you watch some of that stuff and it's like fucking Kermit's pedaling that goddamn bicycle. Like,
wow.
It's like, is he real? Is he?
Justin's got the look on his face for the video watchers that can see it. Justin has a look on his face of like, I think I have to have an intervention with Todd and Gary. That they're slower than I thought. And they're not aware of Muppets.
We're dramatically regressed.
I don't even know how to pick this back up and get us back on track now. There's no
Ralph got fan mail. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, we talked about that last time. He got more fan mail than Jimmy Dean got on the show. Like, and they weren't writing to Jim Henson. Nobody really knew who Jim Henson was yet. He was like the man behind the curtain, but nobody, like, he wasn't a household name during that time. But it was Ralph the dog. Like, people were writing to Ralph specifically as if he were a real thing, which honestly just it just speaks to how good of a performer Jim Henson was, and how he and Frank Oz and Jerry Jewell and all these guys who were working on that were able to breathe life into what is essentially just a pile of cloth and felt. So it's more so than had ever been done in this art, in puppetry before. You know, like they felt real in a way that puppets never really had before. It didn't, like, I think people intellectually, Jimmy Dean intellectually knew that Ralph was a puppet, not real, but in the moment, he's reacting to it, you know, as if it were real. And that's just because of how much, like, Jim Henson imparts life onto this thing. Like, it's honestly just a testament to how good he is and how good he always has been, really, almost from the beginning.
Do you ever think Jim Henson was like on Sesame Street and would like turn on public television and watch like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and see all the hand puppets in the land of make believe and be like, you cheap bitch?
Well, I mean, that's what puppets on TV had always been at that point. Even the shows that he grew up watching, that's what they were. They were just like little hand puppets or marionettes. That's why it's hard to like convey now. We talked about it in the last episode, how people were kind of like blown away by what he was doing. It's commonplace now. We see it everywhere. The Muppets are like a international, you know, sensation. Everybody knows who the Muppets are now, but at the time, like, what people were used to seeing was Howdy Doody and, you know, things like that, like just little hand puppets, like, or maybe a ventriloquist dummy at the most. But they weren't used to seeing something that it was able to be manipulated and come to life in the way that he was able to do with his puppets, which is why it was such a big deal. Like, and it's hard to convey that talking to people, you know, 60, 70 years later, like why that's such a big deal. But if you go back and watch the stuff that people were used to seeing at that time, and then you see Jim Henson stuff alongside it, you're like, it shouldn't even be considered the same art form. Like, it is that advanced that it should, that's why that's why they're Muppets and not puppets, because they are something completely different.
I think famously there's the story of Michelle Obama visiting the set of Sesame Street, of course, with Secret Service. And even Secret Service was completely enraptured.
Who wouldn't be?
Yeah,
like,
it's and you know there's and again, when you're on the set, odds are you can see them. The person manipulating the puppet is right there in front of you, but there's something intangible, dare I say magical, about this art form and about the level that they elevated it to.
Yeah.
There was one point where Grover started running towards Michelle, though, and bad news for him.
They had to take him out.
They had a hard time like getting him in an arm bar, so they just had to tie his arms in a knot.
He's so wiry. Get him down. We can't.
Oh man, he was just doing the near far skit, is all it was, and they just took it a little too seriously.
Right.
All right. So, with his filmmaking ambitions, Jim Henson seemed to have something to prove, it felt like. That something was that he not only had the skills to make a movie, he wanted to prove that he could make a movie. He was a filmmaker, but he also wanted to prove that he could do it without puppets. So, he began sketching out ideas and storyboards for this proposed film, a short feature that he initially called Time to Go, before settling on the final title of Timepiece. Now, while many Muppet-centric projects were works of collaboration, Timepiece was really Jim's show. Although the Muppets Inc. crew, they did spend the next 8 months or so assisting Jim on the film, but Jim himself served as the film's writer, producer, director, animator, and lead actor, where he played, in Jim's words, an everyman frustrated with the typical tasks of a typical day, which I can relate to.
Yeah, it's very relatable.
So, Jim even helped with the music on the film, which was a largely percussive score that was created in collaboration with Don Zabeski, who had been Jimmy Dean's musical director. And this actually wasn't Jim's first foray into music. A few years earlier, almost kind of on a lark, he had recorded a single. He recorded a song called Tick Tock Sick. It's fun. It's pretty catchy. It's a fun little song, but it's definitely influenced by Jim's love of both jazz and novelty records. It definitely feels like a novelty record. And it's thematically in line with his obsessions with time and the kind of constant ticking of life's clock, which is a theme that also resonates in Timepiece.
Definitely. Still, you're getting all those time things, and like the part of the music of that song, or at least a lot of it, if I remember right, was like you hear that,
you hear a ticking clock,
yeah.
So while Jim would claim that this film, Timepiece, was nothing more than an experiment in film editing and rhythm, it's hard to not see it as an extension with this preoccupation with time and the preoccupation with not having enough time. Did you guys have a chance to watch Timepiece? I think this is a fascinating. It's hard to find. It's I had to find it on the Internet Archive. It's not on YouTube or anywhere streaming. It is, I think, at the Museum of the Moving Image is the place where you can officially watch it. I think that's the only place you can officially watch it. But it is on the Internet Archive and a pretty good copy, and it's a cool little short film.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
You could call it it is experimental filmmaking in a way, in that it's not like a straightforward narrative necessarily, but it's only like 7 or 8 minutes long. It's pretty short, and it moves, like the rhythm of it. I love Jim Henson's editing style that he uses here. And he uses this a lot going forward too. This kind of like rat-a-tat rhythm of the way that he edits, and it's really compelling and really fun and really silly. And his big lanky ass just like lumbering from one place to another. He looks like a cartoon character.
Yeah, he absolutely does. It's very high energy, and a lot of that due to the music along with the specifically timed editing. You can't help but get sucked into what's happening in this very short amount of time. But yeah, I dig it.
I can't help but keep going back to, I said this last time, but the connections I keep drawing with him and like David Lynch.
Yeah.
Everything about Jim Henson just seems to like, it's weird how parallel.
Yeah, it's like two sides of the same coin. Like they're very different, obviously, but there are a remarkable number of similarities, including Jim Henson a few years after this got into transcendental meditation.
Wicked.
Yeah, so he was in that realm too. So it's really weird, the parallels between the two, even though their careers could seem like they could not be like more different.
Well, I've been watching all this, like reading stuff about David Lynch here recently, because as we're recording this, he's just passed away. I just like watching him talk.
Yeah.
And so just watching David Lynch speak about things. And I think you may have posted this in our Discord, but there was one clip where like somebody asked him about filmmaking. And he talks about like the circle, how it can be different for each person, like how it's experienced. But like part of it is your eyes, and then part of it's like what you hear with your ears. And then the other part's like the experience of the person or something, basically. Along those lines. He says it better than me, obviously. But I saw that like right before I sat down and watched Timepiece, and it made me think of that too. Just how Jim Henson's stuff, it also has this like rhythm, like what you were talking about, and like and even with like TikTok Sick or this, there's like that snare, that jazz, and the pictures like moving with it and stuff. And I was like, he has that like interesting want to connect the way the music feels with what you're seeing on screen. And
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just interesting how they both work together that way. Also, totally forgot when I was reading the David Lynch thing that his father too was working for the Department of Agriculture.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
weird.
Yeah,
Jeez.
very strange, very strange. So Timepiece premiered in May of 1965 at the Museum of Modern Art and later became a success on the Arthouse circuit, including an 18-month run at the Paris Theater in New York. It was even nominated for an Oscar for Best Live Action Short in 1966. Didn't win, but it was nominated, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
The movie that did win, you haven't heard of it because we're not talking about the guy who made it anymore, I don't think. So. some French comedy, I don't know. But we're not doing a series on him, are we? We're talking about the loser here today.
That feels like the Oscars a lot of times.
Yeah, exactly. The success of Timepiece proved to everyone, including Jim himself, that he was much more than just, the puppet guy. Though he'd far from abandoned the world of puppetry, even working on a pilot called The Land of Tinkerdy, which featured a human actor who interacts with a Muppet dog in his workshop, a workshop that also acts as an entrance into a magical realm. So while that pilot never got picked up, one can't help but hear that description of it and see its influence on a little show called Fraggle Rock, which came along a couple decades later.
That's crazy to go back and see. Like, he had this idea early on. And like, Fraggle Rock is obviously evolved out of this.
Mm-hmm.
Except the dog talks.
Except the dog talks in this one, yeah.
Yeah, Rufus talks, and he sounds like Michael J. Fox.
It's pretty interesting. I mean, it's not like his best work, but it is, knowing that Fraggle Rock's going to come on later, it is really interesting to see how it clearly grew out of these ideas. And that happens a few times throughout Jim Henson's career, where something that doesn't work or doesn't get picked up or doesn't happen gets reworked later on for something that we now know is like an iconic work.
It's actually still going back to it. It's a funny little the one thing you've got of it. It's really funny. Like, their timing is just, I don't know, the way he writes is like just the timing between the lines are just
Yeah, it's very like Laurel and Hardy, like there's a lot of back and forth banter, which I think is what makes some of this, even the stuff on the Muppet Show. I mean, that's a lot of what the Muppet Show is just characters bantering back and forth. Happens on Sesame Street as well. I mean, Bert and Ernie are one of our great comedy duos.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking of that just because he writes dialogue could be on a show, like just on a sitcom or something.
Yeah, he's just giving it to Muppets.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just interesting that he has that. He's a very good writer. It's just interesting that he also had that skill in there too. But he just went this Muppet path.
Yep. So as the Muppets grew and the company took on more projects, it became necessary for Jim to bring on more team members. The most memorable addition to the team during this time was Jerry Nelson, a young actor turned puppeteer who'd originally been hired on a part-time basis to work on the Jimmy Dean Show, where he performed as Ralph's left hand after Frank Oz was drafted into the Army to serve in Vietnam. We should also note, I guess, that Oz never ended up serving in Vietnam. He actually left and went to go to Vietnam. Gave another guy's job and everything. He's going to go off, and then he gets there to, I guess, I don't know where you go when you get put in the Army, but he goes to he thinks he's being shipped off, and then he ends up getting rejected because he has a minor heart condition. So he just they had this big going away party. He leaves, and then 2 hours later, he walks back in the door. It's like, oh, I'm not going. He had already taken the time off and planned on taking the time off. So he didn't want Jerry Nelson to, this guy's he thinks he's got a secure job because Frank Oz is going off to Vietnam, and he didn't want to kick the guy out. So he ended up going over to Europe and visiting some of his family for the next few months. So Jerry Nelson kept his job, which is great because Jerry Nelson is one of the major Muppeteers. He is a major part of Muppets Incorporated. He later became a full-time member of Muppets Inc., and he worked with the Muppets all the way up until his death in 2012. So as Jim's professional family grew, so did his biological one. In April 1965, this was a recurring theme on the last episode, I think, but in April of 1965, Jane gave birth to yet another Henson child. This is their fourth one for those keeping score, and this was John, the second son. At Muppets Incorporated, Jim continued to push the boundaries for what puppets could do. In a series of ads for La Choy Chinese food, Jim designed and built his first full-sized walk-around character, a dragon named Delbert, played by with some regret, Frank Oz. Delbert would serve as the prototype for the same sort of life-size puppet that's eventually going to be used on Big Bird on Sesame Street.
First thing to note here is I did not know until now that they have canned chow mein.
Yeah, I watched so many of these La Choy commercials because they're funny. They're really funny, especially the ones that are set in the actual supermarket. Like some of the early ones are set like on a set where the dragon comes in. This dragon, by the way, full-size dragon. So Frank Oz's hand is like up in the mouth and he's moving the other hand with his own. But they built it, Don Salin built it to where it could breathe fire. The puppet itself could breathe fire. And you see it in some of the commercials. But the ones where they're actually in the grocery store and he's like knocking cans because he's so big.
Right, with his tail.
Yeah. He's knocking everything over. They're really, really funny. And I kept watching them because there's a ton of them on YouTube. And my wife, when she went to the grocery store this week, had La Choy on the brain and bought a can of La Choy canned noodles.
I was watching. I was like, wow, they had this in the back of the day, and then I Googled it. I was like,
yeah,
this is still a thing.
She got it at the Walmart neighborhood market a mile from my house. Like they're still a very prominent brand. Yeah. Canned Chinese food.
Yeah, and I thought this was cool because I think in Idea Man they briefly mentioned the dragon.
They show him briefly in it,
yeah, a predecessor to Big Bird.
Mm-hmm.
So I was interested to see it. And then at first he's like on stage, like he's another puppet, like he's or Muppet. Yeah. I mean, with the hands and stuff.
You still see his full body, but they don't get the full use of his whole body because he doesn't have anywhere to walk around.
Yeah, I was going to say, you don't really get that until like he's in the supermarket and you see him towering over like a mom and her kid or something. And those are just fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Like, because I will say right now, just to make Justin doubt me even more, I did not know how Big Bird worked before this. So I had not ever seen.
I mean, we'll talk about it when we get there, but the mechanics of Big Bird are fascinating. Just from a performance standpoint and from just an engineering standpoint, honestly.
Yeah.
The way that he's built.
No, it's crazy. It's fun to watch like the evolution of some of these ideas or concepts that Jim Henson has, and knowing that he had them. Like we're still like, this is why we have to do all of these episodes ahead of time, because even by the time you get to Sesame Street, he's got like 15 years of working up to this or something.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's a lot of like innovative and very important work that Jim Henson's doing before he ever makes a feature-length movie. And obviously we are a movie podcast, but you can't talk about Jim Henson without hell, Big Bird shows up in the Muppet movie. So you get we gotta set the stage. It's all about context. So in early 1966, Jim Henson gets contacted by an executive at IBM, and he's asked to participate in a kind of unusual project. This executive, a guy named David Laser, and I will say, remember that name. Hard to forget a name like David Laser. What a cool name. Right. And he works for a computer company. Come on, really? David Laser? Anyway, we'll talk about him more later. He was looking to create a series of what he called coffee breaks. These would be short films that would be screened internally at IBM. So these are not designed to be shown on TV or anything like that. These are specifically to be used in the offices at IBM during business meetings and on staff retreats, things like that. And these films would sometimes be used to promote new products, to kind of let the staff know about new stuff they're working on. But just as often, they were just used as comedic icebreakers during corporate events. And a lot of these films featured Ralph the dog as a bumbling IBM salesman, although some, like there's one called Paperwork Explosion, they allowed Jim to experiment with film and editing techniques that he'd go on to use in other projects. But that Paperwork Explosion one specifically is like pretty incredible to me. Like it's pretty cool, and it's not like a Muppet centric one. It's a montage of footage. I don't think there's any Muppets in it. It's a lot of like image overlay and using all these like kind of what I guess were pretty innovative editing techniques at the time. And it uses that same kind of like editing rhythm that he used in TikTok or in Timepiece. It's a cool little short film, and it's wild that it was basically just a piece of corporate marketing to be used internally, because as just a short film, like it is pretty entertaining and it's pretty short. I mean, that's one of the shorter ones. The Ralph the Salesman one is, I don't know, it's probably 20 minutes long, 20 minutes long.
The horn rim glasses lady was not a very good actress, but
I don't think she was an actress.
Yeah, she's like, there are so many changes in the world.
Yeah.
It's just some like flat line.
That was like
But
David
yeah.
Laser's secretary or something, probably.
But yeah, the one thing is like you were saying, like when you start to see Jim Henson's filmmaking, it's hard not to see Jim Henson's filmmaking. I guess a little like David Lynch again, that it's like there's definitely like something
A very
that, like,
distinctive style.
Yeah.
yeah, that when you see it even later in Sesame Street, like the segments that they do where he's playing around, you're like, oh, holy shit, I never realized this before, but this is totally Jim Henson.
Yeah, you can almost like pick it up, like even without knowing which ones are Jim Henson's.
I feel like there's a lot of the signature isms of any one particular director. Sam Raimi's got them, Tim Burton's got them. You can watch a certain thing and be like, I bet they're involved somehow because this totally feels like something they would do. And yeah, Jim Henson's no different. Like that editing style, the music, we've already talked about like the Muppets versus just standard traditional puppetry is so different and elevated. So yeah, this totally makes sense.
Bro, you saying that right now, it just made me think of Sam Raimi and, especially in the Evil Dead movies. Well, no, and even like Drag Me to Hell or something like that. There's those scenes, those like little quick, they're not montages, but sort of.
I call them montages, yeah. Like the
but
the
we're like
groovy, like him getting ready for
exactly.
battle
And that
scene.
feels like a Jim Henson thing almost, like the way that it skips through there, like it just got kind of a neat rhythm to it. I don't know.
I know Sam Raimi was highly influenced by like, the Three Stooges and stuff like that, but I have to imagine I bet he was a Muppets fan.
He probably was.
I bet he was.
It's hard to imagine somebody being like, you know what? Fuck the Muppets.
Who doesn't like the Muppets? Yeah, exactly. So David Laser was thrilled with the results of these IBM films, and he would ask Henson back to do another series of films for IBM a few years later. And the two of them got along so well that they would continue their professional partnership outside of IBM for decades to come.
I cannot imagine being an IBM, like you're training to be a sales exec and you're sitting in a training class and they throw on the one with Ralph the dog.
Right.
Like, and you're like working for IBM, which I have to imagine. Well, so my father-in-law actually retired from IBM. Like he worked for IBM for forever. So when I started seeing this, I messaged him and I like sent him some of the videos. Like, did you have to watch any of these training videos? And he was like, I watched a lot of shitty training videos, but never had any Muppets. So he missed out on that. But,
it probably made them more entertaining for people. Who wants to watch a corporate training video? Throw some Muppets in there. It's always going to be better.
It's just weird thinking about some guys in suits, like with their like leather portfolios.
And this is like in the mid
like,
60s. So you think like this is like Mad Men. So
I was going to
like,
say they're like ad execs for Mad Men.
It's like you're watching Don Draper sitting back with a cigarette watching Ralph the dog.
Everybody in the world wants to come work for IBM. What the fuck is this?
So when he wasn't making commercials or corporate videos, Jim Henson continued to be a pretty hot commodity for variety shows like Ed Sullivan. He was a regular on Ed Sullivan, as well as, he kept appearing on The Tonight Show. He was also on the Perry Como Christmas special that year. This is like 1966 or so, and became a regular on the Jack Parr program as well. So one appearance on the Jack Parr show in late 1964, and this was filmed at NBC Studios in New York. It resulted in one of my favorite Henson anecdotes. So Henson and his team showed up at the studio at about 10 a.m. for morning rehearsal, only to be told that they wouldn't be needed until like 4 o'clock that afternoon. So Jim, Jerry, Jewel, Frank Oz, and Dod Sutherland, they're all there together to do the show, and they're lounging around in their dressing room, just kind of bored, nothing to do, until at some point, while they were kind of wandering around, one of them opened the door in the room. There's this door over to the side. Not the door they entered through, just another door in the room. They opened it up because they were curious. They wanted to see where it led. Like, why not? We're bored. Let's explore a little bit. They open up this door, and inside they just find a shallow closet filled with a maze of pipes. Just a closet full of pipes. So out of boredom, they're like, you know what? We're going to be sitting here for a few more hours. Let's entertain ourselves. So they gather all this material that they'd brought for the show. They had paint, extra eyeballs for puppet touch-ups, pieces of felt and fur and things like that, just in case one of the puppets got damaged or something and they had to do some touch-ups. They had all this stuff with them. So they started using all this stuff and started decorating the pipes. So soon enough, the pipes were covered in paint, fake fur, googly eyes, roaring mouths that had been drawn on. And at one point, they actually ran out of materials, and they were so into it that they sent, I don't know which one of them went, but one of them went down the street to the Muppets Inc. building, their office where the Muppet Workshop was, which is just a couple blocks away, to get more stuff because they're like, we can't stop now. We got to keep going. So as they worked on this is over the course of like several hours, as they worked, people at the studio began to hear about this closet art project that those weird Muppet guys were doing upstairs, right? So folks started stopping by to like take pictures of it. And by that afternoon, even Jack Parr himself had gotten wind of it. And he sent a cameraman to film the closet for his TV audience to be able to see it. So he actually wanted to show this on TV. And those Muppet pipes are still there. They're still there, and they're actually behind glass now. They have turned it into sort of an exhibit there at NBC Studios. Like they're behind glass with like red curtains on the side. Red curtains to make it look kind of like the Muppet stage a little bit. Yeah. It's really, I would love to visit. I don't think the public can just visit. Maybe if you get a tour of NBC Studios, like an official tour, I wonder if they take you on that.
We were, when we were in New York last year, Kat and I were dangerously close to touring Rockefeller Center. And they do tours all the time. I got to imagine this is on the tour.
It's got to be, because otherwise, why would they display it the way that they do?
Yeah, exactly.
It's pretty cool. It's I don't know. I love that it's still there. There's a great video where there's one where Gene Shalit visits it. Gene Shalit did it like on his show back in the 80s, but there's another one more recent where Frank Oz went and visited. He tells the whole story about it and points out little details on it. I think there's even one part signed on there that says "Love the Muppets" or something like that, where they kind of autographed it that way. It's very cool. We'll post pictures of it on our social media. But those Muppet pipes are pretty special. It's just like, I don't know. There's something, because they didn't plan on people to see it right away. Yeah. They were going to do it, close the closet back, and go on with their day and hope that somebody would find it later on. But obviously word got out a lot faster. But pretty fantastic. I love it. And you can't move it unless the building gets torn down. They're going to be there forever.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I wonder like what happens though if somebody's going to fix the pipes. So
presumably those pipes are no longer in use. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that.
Or they're super special because so much celebrity shit has been through them.
Like literal. You think they're Dookie pipes?
Yeah. Like they could be. I don't know.
They could. I don't think they are, but who knows? I'm not a plumber.
Not with that attitude.
So by 1967, Jim's thinking was leaning a little bit more experimental. Anyone who's watched Timepiece can attest to this. It's, like I said before, it's kind of an experimental film. And he had hoped to continue to use his creativity to create more works outside of the world of puppetry, resulting in an incredibly ambitious project that he called Cyclia. Is that how you'd say that? Or Cyclia?
Yeah, I was leaning towards Cyclia, but yeah.
Cyclia. Cyclia. Well, however you want to say that. Cyclia.
Yeah, I was going Cyclia is how I did it, but I don't know.
Well,
but
whatever.
It sounded more like psychedelic, which is how it looked,
yeah, but like I was thinking cyclical. Like,
shit.
That's true. Yeah.
Anyway, we'll have to ask
Jim Henson. Hold on. Let me call him up.
Well, anyway, Cyclia was to be a cross between experimental live theater, film, and a nightclub. So this was basically Jim Henson's nightclub concept. So it was inspired by psychedelic stage shows of bands like Jefferson Airplane, who, by the way, what's her name from Jefferson Airplane sings some of the songs on Sesame Street. I just found this out. I think it was in one of the documentaries that I watched, but they mentioned her, and I didn't know the name, but I was like, Buddy's like, oh, that was so and so, and I was like, who is that? She's like, that's the singer from Jefferson Airplane. So like, I guess Jim Henson was just really into Jefferson Airplane.
Wow.
But he had seen them live and had seen their stage show, which was called Psychedelic, and that's kind of partially what gave him the idea for this nightclub.
Oh, Grace Slick, is that who you're
Grace
talking
Slick?
about?
Yep, that's who it is. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, they show up in that Youth 68 thing, which we'll mention, but they're also in there too.
Yeah, so he just must be a big Jefferson Airplane fan.
Nice.
I wonder how he felt about Starship. Anyway, Jim envisioned a space where the walls, floor, and ceiling would be broken up into these crystal-like shapes. They kind of remind me of the aggro crag from Guts, honestly, if you look at pictures of them. But these shapes would be all over the walls and ceiling, and he would project films that would be choreographed to the music being played. completely immersing his visitors in a sea of images and sound. It's a pretty insane, incredibly ambitious project. Some of the films that he shot are out there because he did shoot some footage for them. He even hired someone to help him find possible locations and potential investors. And a lot of the footage that they used for it was actually shot. It was shot on 16 millimeter by Frank Oz. And Frank Oz says that he uses this. This was kind of his first experience as a filmmaker, and it sort of became a stepping stone to his later career as a movie director. Like, he credits this whole experience into turning him into a movie director, basically. So when he wasn't working on Cyclia, I've just decided on that pronunciation.
I support your decision.
Yeah,
We should each have our own
yeah.
like pronunciation.
So when he wasn't working on it, Jim had regular writing sessions with Jerry Jewell, coming up with ideas for countless TV series and specials, each one more outlandish than the last. Now, some of these involved Muppets, other ones didn't, but Jim was having a hard time finding a network that was willing to take a chance on some of his wilder ideas. However, a unique opportunity came along when NBC launched a new show called NBC Experiment in Television, a program that catered to avant-garde and experimental filmmakers. It's a wild concept to think about for network TV.
Oh, very.
But Jim pitched an idea to NBC for a documentary to be shown on this program that he called A Collage of Today. The concept for the film, in Jim's words, was to communicate the ideas of youth in the forms they understand, employing film and video media in new and exciting ways to best convey not only the substance, but the mood of the young. I think that was part of his pitch to NBC. And however he sold it to them, it worked. Because NBC greenlit the film with a budget of $100,000, and Jim dug into the project over the next 2 months. The resulting film, which was retitled as Youth 68, premiered on NBC in April of 1968, and it was, like Timepiece, a multimedia collage, only this time using interviews with real people, with music overlapping, spoken commentary, and many times the screen was split into multiple images. It's a really fascinating thing. I haven't seen the whole thing. There's only clips of it online. You can definitely, I want to see the whole thing because you can definitely see just in the clips that are available the potential of how cool it could be.
It's one of the dudes from Jefferson Airplane. I don't remember his name, but he's got like the little toy pistol. I assume it's a toy pistol.
I think it might be a real. I think
it might be a real
pistol.
Okay, so way more threatening than I would have guessed. But yeah, anyway, the one thing I took away from most of the clips I saw from this is that although they use words like everybody's got a different bag, baby, the youth of 68 sounded a lot like the youth of any generation. It seems like
just different slang. They're not saying like Riz and stuff like that, but yeah,
right. But they still thought that their parents had fucked it all up and they got to fix it.
Yeah, I mean, and this was, you got to think, this is during the Vietnam War. It was a fairly apolitical film in that Jim wasn't trying to push a political agenda. He was just kind of letting people talk, and no matter where they stood on things, just letting them talk and turning it into a collage of opinions and a collage of today, as he originally called it. Pretty fascinating. I really wish I could watch the whole thing. I could not find it anywhere. It's not on the Internet Archive. I think it might be also available to watch at the Museum of the Moving Image, which is in New York. I'm not 100% sure on that. So all you can see are a couple of clips from it on the Jim Henson Company official YouTube and the website. So while Jim Henson was the primary creative force behind Youth 68, if you were to look it up on, IMDb or Letterboxd, you're going to see a different name credited as the director. And that's a guy by the name of John Stone. John Stone, big part of Jim Henson's story. Stone was a Yale-educated writer and producer who'd begun his career in television working on the iconic children's program Captain Kangaroo before moving on to Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. That was the puppet show created by Henson's friend Burr Tillstrom. We talked about that a little bit last time. So Stone and Henson first met in the early 1960s when they'd been thrown together by a producer at CBS to work on a television pilot that Stone was developing, which was sort of a Cinderella spoof that combined live action and puppetry. So Henson was going to be the puppetry side of that equation, obviously. The pilot never really went anywhere, but Jim and Stone struck up a friendship, and a few years later, Henson hired Stone to direct Youth 68 for him. And the show, when it aired on NBC, was a major critical hit, with one writer saying, "No television program on a commercial network that I have seen utilized the possibilities of the TV camera to the extent this show did." I mean, and it's hard to explain why he's being so enthusiastic about it unless you watch some clips from it, because like he did in, his stuff for Cyclia and his stuff even in like that paperwork explosion video for IBM and Timepiece, like he's using a lot of really interesting experimental editing techniques where you've got overlapping images. You've got like there's like an image of a dancing body at one point in Youth 68 with other images kind of projected upon it, which was actually a concept he was going to use for the nightclub. He was actually going to have a dancer in the middle of the nightclub with a projection on their body. So he's sort of using that, but in Youth 68, it's a post-production technique. It reminds me of some of the James Bond credits a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
So once again, I mean, it was clear that Jim had proven that his talent extended beyond the Muppets as an artist. And around this time, Henson made what seems like a small, but was in fact a pretty significant decision for his company, changing the name from Muppets Incorporated to Henson Associates, or HA, H-A, with an exclamation point, is how he wrote it out.
It's fucking brilliant.
It's pretty great. Yeah, he did this a lot. Like he had a lot of like fun acronyms for the different divisions of Henson Associates. But with this name change, he was making a point. His company was about more than Muppets, for one thing. So no more Muppets Incorporated, because that's not all they wanted to be known for. And also, very importantly, it was now his name over the door, not the Muppets. He wanted to know, like, I am Jim Henson, filmmaker, artist, and this is my company. This isn't just the Muppet Company. Because, like I said, for years, people knew the Muppets, but they didn't know who Jim Henson was. Well, now they were going to know who Jim Henson was. So Henson and Jerry Jewell, they continued to work on ideas for new projects, including a feature-length movie script called The Tale of Sand, which they were never able to get off the ground, although it did become a graphic novel in 2014. I think it's out of print right now, but you can still find it. And then finally, in late 1968, Jim pulled out an old script of his that had been unsuccessfully shopped around called The Cube. Everyone had passed on it before, but Jim described it as an original surrealistic comedy that dramatizes the complex, baffling problems of reality versus illusion.
I watched a few minutes of this. I still haven't gotten around to watching the whole thing, but the shocking part to me is that there is no connection between this movie and Cube from 1997. I was like, oh, this has to have influenced.
That was shocking to you?
I mean, it's such a unique concept that I was like, they have to be connected in some way. Like there has to be some sort of note of inspiration or something, but none that I could find. So I was
they could not be more different.
Oh yeah, they're very very different. They're very different, but it like at its core.
Well, the initial concept.
Yeah, the initial concept, I was just kind of like, there has to be some sort of.
Well, in that if you're saying initial concept, in that there's a guy in a cube, but beyond that, it's like, I mean, because Cube is a horror movie.
Yeah, but like the psychological stuff. I guess in the scenes that I've seen so far, you can see the tension is building. And so I was just kind of like, oh, this must be connected, if not as just an inspiration, but no connection that I found, which was kind of weird.
We have to put the song right here because it got stuck in my head.
You'll never get out. You'll never get out. You'll never get out of the cube. It says you'll never get out. You'll never get out. You'll never get out till you're dead, dead, dead. Till you're dead, dead, dead. Till you're dead, dead, dead.
The Cube, we'll talk about it more in a minute, but the Cube is interesting. So NBC, they were still enthusiastic about Jim's work on Youth 68, so they gave him the go-ahead to film the project for Experiment in Television. And The Cube would actually be the first time that Jim would produce a serious full-length feature using professional actors with no puppets. So this is just an hour-long, essentially, like, short film. I mean, feature length, but it's about an hour. The Cube aired in late February 1969, and it's probably best described as resembling an avant-garde episode of The Twilight Zone, or for a more modern comparison, Black Mirror. Like, it very much felt like a Black Mirror episode to me.
Yeah, totally.
It features an unnamed man trapped in a cube-like white room, while various people can enter and leave, but which he himself apparently can't. So, like, people come in these doors, and he interacts with them, but he can't leave through their doors. Basically, the concept is that he has to find his own door to leave. So it's this really like psychological, like it's hard to describe. cube, but it's interesting.
And so I couldn't help but think about it still had similar themes to like we see with Jim Henson with like time and then also
Existentialism, for
yeah,
sure.
I was gonna say I couldn't help but notice that there was some of this would have been as he's starting to get into some of the Sesame Street discussions, I would imagine too.
Yeah. There's a lot of overlap here. We're going in as much chronological order as we can, but at this point, when he worked on the cube, he was already dipping his toes into Sesame Street. Yeah.
And as we talk about that, I mean, there's things that he's concerned about with working on Sesame Street, which I wondered if he was thinking about while he's doing this. I don't know, but the song is catchy.
The song is catchy, and the show itself is pretty interesting. It's a little dry, I think. It doesn't have it has some humor in it.
It's slow for sure.
It's a little slow, yeah, for an hour long. Like I feel like the concept is really cool, and it would have served better as a 20-minute short film probably than a 55-minute.
It's a weird and again, having not finished it, but the clips that I saw, it kind of reminded me of like pre-Christopher Eccleston Doctor Who episode.
From a production value standpoint,
Yeah.
I thought the exact same thing.
Yeah.
It has that, because it has that cheap, like, shot on whatever cameras they used for television in the 60s. You know, it's
Right.
got a very specific look to it.
Yeah.
I thought the exact same thing when I was watching it. I thought this feels like an old episode of Doctor Who. Like, just not content wise necessarily, but just from a production value standpoint. But it's a pretty wild thing to think that this showed on like a Thursday or Friday night on NBC on like primetime television. And you're watching this. I could just imagine people going like, what the hell?
You're 100% right. I picture people in like rural Georgia just being like, "What the fuck?" is this?
Right? Yeah. But as an experiment, I mean, and if you're really interested in Jim Henson's work, which if you're listening to this, I assume you're at least somewhat interested in Jim Henson's work. It is a fascinating piece of that. It's not wholly successful, but it is ambitious. And it definitely shows that Jim Henson had more on his mind than just puppetry.
Yeah.
He had ideas. He had big ideas. I mean, there are a lot of big ideas introduced in this. Now, response to the Cube was pretty mixed, with viewers either loving or hating it. One of my favorite reviews came from a viewer from California named Mr. Dion. That's the name that he signed, who wrote his review. He wrote that the most disciplined attention I could give it was a belch from the grave of Marcus Aurelius, occasioned, I might add, by the dead weight of its own dust caving in on itself. 2 weeks later, Jim Henson wrote a one-sentence response to that review, which read, "Dear Mr. Dion, what the fuck are you talking about? Yours truly, Jim Henson."
Here's the thing, like, that response just gets infinitely better if you hear it in Jim Henson's voice.
Because that's basically Kermit the Frog.
Because it's Kermit the Frog, yeah. What the fuck are you talking about? Yeah.
It's pretty funny, and Jim Henson rarely used curse words, so the fact that he did in this case, that Mr. Dion touched a nerve, I guess. Also, like, listen to that review. What the fuck is he talking about?
Yeah. Oh
yeah, it's a real haughty review of his thing. I don't know. It sounds
the dead
like
weight of its own dust caving in on itself. That sentence doesn't even make sense. What are you talking about, dude?
I think Mr. Dion was a very young Jordan Peterson. So
after the Cube, Jim continued to pursue other projects, wanting to work on something bigger than the 1 hour specials and so forth that he'd been doing for years. And he briefly collaborated with cartoonist Johnny Hart on an adaptation of his comic, The Wizard of Id. That's like a comic as in newspaper comic, if you're not familiar with The Wizard of Iz. He went so far as to film a short pilot, but the project was abandoned when Hart lost interest.
this was another, and I just thought this was interesting that he ends up going and working on this, because I remember this when I was growing up in the newspaper comic section.
Oh yeah,
right
me too.
next to Pogo. So
I remember Wizard of Id, and I remember it as one of the comics I always skipped.
yeah,
Maybe it was like too adult, or like the humor was too adult or something. But when I was a kid, I remember the Wizard of Oz being one that I did not care about. Like it's one that it was just always there, and I just went on to the next one. But the test pilot is, because you can watch that test pilot or clips from it. It exists out there, and the puppets are cool. Like they look great. It's all filmed. It's all on a set. But I don't know. It's neat. It just it never happened for whatever reason.
It's got some fun dialogue. My favorite line in it is when all the people are shouting at the king or whatever, and he turns around. He's like, "Wizard, do you have a potion for courage in the face of adversity?" "I did, but you drank all the gin last night."
That's a good line. That's a great line. So while trying to get other projects off the ground, Jim continued to churn out commercials. This was still kind of their main source of income, really, at this point. One memorable series of ads from this period were for Frito-Lay, who hired Jim to create a series of spots for Muncho's potato chips. The star of the commercials was a familiar-looking, snack-stealing monster obsessed with munching potato chips.
My kind of fellow.
Well, Frito-Lay loved the spots, and they asked Jim to create more, but by that time, Jim was no longer interested because that next big project that he'd been looking for had finally come along and was taking up a lot of his attention. And besides, he'd be taking the Muncho's monster along with him, although in this new iteration, the monster would no longer obsessively munch on potato chips, but he would eat cookies instead.
Cookie Monster.
Thanks, Gary. Wow. What a contribution.
Yeah. I was confused by this because I was watching Idea Man. I was watching it in segments, and I was getting to like early things of Cookie Monster. This was obviously, I guess, the first appearance of Cookie Monster.
Well, there was another set of ads that he had been used in for these other like snacks that were like little wheels. They look like little wheels.
Okay.
I can't remember what they were called. Either the commercials didn't get used, or it was like a one-time thing. But it was the same Cookie Monster, but he had teeth. He had like sharp.
I was going to say, so all I was trying to get to is that at some point Cookie Monster had some scary fucking teeth.
Yeah. So that was on these like pinwheel chip things. They're like, I don't know what they were, but they look like little wagon wheels kind of chips. And he was used to sell those, and he had big pointy teeth. And then by time the Munchos commercials came along, they had gotten rid of the teeth. So he basically looked like what we know Cookie Monster to look like. Only he was eating potato chips. And they had made the puppet in a way where there was actually a hole like in the mouth, so that like when they ate potato chips, it would like go down the sleeve of Jim Henson or Frank Oz or whoever was portraying the monster at that point. So when he was eating, he was actually like, so they had just had a sleeve full of potato chips. Like,
sounds awful.
It does sound itchy. Sounds itchy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I just was thinking, like, when I saw those old pictures of Cookie Monster or old clips of Cookie Monster with the teeth, I was like, what an important design choice.
Yeah,
Because
I think he was maybe a little too scary for the children.
I was like,
with
he
the
would have
teeth.
traumatized me as a child.
Yeah,
Like, those
yeah.
teeth are wild when he just
Yeah.
starts, like, gnawing on his stuff.
Yeah, so that was pre-Munchos. But the Munchos commercials, he made a few of those, a handful of them. And like I said, Frito-Lay wanted to keep doing it, but Jim was like kind of done with that. He had sunny days ahead of him.
Hey, I see what you did there.
That's the song.
What are you doing?
It's the song from Sesame Street, because we're about to talk about Sesame Street.
It's fucked up that song is still in my brain.
Oh, will forever be.
Yeah.
Will forever be. It's an earworm. It's catchy. I was watching Sesame. I've watched so much Sesame Street this week for a man of my age.
Did you learn anything?
I was gonna say, how are your numbers, letters, and colors, Justin?
I'm doing great. Colors up. I'm colorblind, so I'm not great. But
Hey, 2 out of 3. 2 out of 3 ain't bad.
numbers and letters I'm good with.
Good.
I watched one today where Kermit the Frog was describing the letter B, and he said it kind of looks like a fat guy with his belt too tight. I've never heard it described that way, but he's not wrong.
Yeah.
And that was a skit featuring the Cookie Monster, actually, because
But
Cookie Monster kept eating the B, and he made it look like an R. Then he made it look like a P because he was eating pieces of the letter. Anyway.
Awesome.
But some kid somewhere remembered B because of that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
Well, Jim Henson was actually a kind of a late addition to the Sesame Street plan. The concept for the show had been thought up by producer Joan Gans Cooney, who sought to create a television show for children that could both educate and entertain. Because you see, at the time, most children's TV shows were produced by local stations with very little regard for education or cultural diversity. And the idea for using a television show as an educational tool was, at the time, practically revolutionary.
If you haven't at this point watched Jim Henson Idea Man, do yourself a favor, check it out, because when they start talking about Joan Cooney, it sounds like the lady deserves her own documentary. Like at one point they were talking about the moves she was making and the revolutionary things that she was bringing to the table. And they even go as far as to say, like, had she done X, Y, or Z, I forget the exact context, but they're like, she was pretty much the most powerful woman in television. Like,
yeah,
this is a fascinating individual.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and she had some huge ideas. Like, what she was doing was unheard of at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the hosts of a lot of these like locally produced TV shows, or even the ones that were national, a lot of them were, as one writer put it, insufferably condescending, with the exception being Captain Kangaroo, created and hosted by Bob Keeshan. So the time was ripe for a new type of children's program, and Cooney was going to lead the charge with the help of experimental psychologist and philanthropist Lloyd Morissette. So Lloyd Morissette and Joan Gans Cooney are basically the godmother and godfather of Sesame Street, as we know it. One of the main focuses of this new show was to reach children from disadvantaged backgrounds who historically tested more poorly in school due to a lack of educational resources. But they still wanted to make the show accessible to kids of all socioeconomic and ethnic backgrounds, using high production values, sophisticated writing, and quality film and animation in order to reach the largest audience possible. Equally important, Cooney thought, was that the humor on the show needed to be entertaining to older viewers as well, because parents and older siblings tended to control what was on TV. And if they saw some boring kids show on the TV, they were going to change the channel. So it needed to be something that would be entertaining to everyone, even though it was also proving to be educational for younger kids, especially. I think the 3 to 5 year old is what they were kind of like really targeting.
Yeah.
So with a $1 million grant from the Carnegie Corporation, where Morissette served as vice president, Cooney established the Children's Television Workshop, with additional funds coming from the U.S. federal government, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the Ford Foundation, which gave the show a total starting budget of $8 million. Now, that's about $60 million today, I think. That's a considerable amount of money. Now, this kind of budget, which was unprecedented for this type of programming, it really gave them the resources to create the type of high quality show that they were aiming for, and also gave them the ability to bring on the types of creators that public television shows would not have been able to afford in the past.
So just really briefly here, and this might just be pointing out what a dumb, unobservant guy I am, but if you think about the Sesame Street logo,
it looks like a street sign.
Yeah, it looks like a street sign. It's got a yellow border around it.
I thought
that's the point.
Was that
yeah? He was just going to point out that it
just discovered that.
No. But there's that loop at the top with some letters in it, CTW, and it stands for Children's Television Workshop. As I distinctly remember as a kid going, what does that mean? And of course, revisiting all this stuff now, it's just kind of, oh yeah, Children's Television Workshop.
And I don't think that's on the logo anymore, because Children's Television I don't think, I could be wrong, but Children's Television Workshop changed its name years later to it's just Sesame Workshop now. So it's no longer known as Children's Television Workshop. So it would be kind of weird for it to be on present day, but I'm not sure. I could be wrong. They could have left it up there as a legacy thing. I don't know.
It's stopped after 95. It looks like I'm looking at it now.
Really?
Yeah, starting in 95, it switched to a 1, 2, 3.
Which
I think I have seen that. Yeah. Huh. That's wild. Man, kind of disappointing.
Well, it's not. Well, I mean, it doesn't make sense to have it on there anymore. But
yeah, I get it.
One interesting thing about what you're saying, though, is that like the host being so condescending. I was thinking about that. Captain Kangaroo was probably a little before my time. I remember seeing it.
It was way before your time. Yeah.
Well, I just mean,
I think my parents watched
Captain Kangaroo. I remember seeing like replays of it on like public television or something. So like I know I've seen Captain Kangaroo, and he looked like just like a goofy, fun older guy
Old
or
guy,
something.
yeah.
Yeah. Because I imagine it is when they say condescending, I can picture like somebody feeling like you're talking down
to
kids.
children. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there are
And-
exceptions. I mean, Mr. Rogers is an exception, but he wasn't like nationally known yet at this time. Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street were almost like kind
at
of
the same time.
Yeah, except but Mr. Rogers at the time I think was mostly just in Philadelphia.
Yeah,
I
you might
don't
be
think it
right,
was
yeah.
national yet. That's because George Romero.
But they
worked on
both
it.
kicked off like right at that like end of the 60s thing
Yeah.
and like start of the 70s. But yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go is like you got to kind of be careful with that. It's like a fine line. Like Mr. Rogers is probably the most talking to you like you're a child, but he's like looking at them, talking to them, not like at them. And,
right. Yeah.
and
Like he's
so-
your friend, not like he's
Yeah.
an adult that's looking down on you because you're a kid. I think Mr. Rogers would be an exception to that as well, but I don't think he was in their mind at this time because he wasn't like a known quantity yet at this time.
Yeah. Whereas like with Sesame Street, they do get into like it's just fun.
Yeah. So one of the creators that they were able to hire was a guy named John Stone. Remember that guy, Jim Henson's old colleague, the guy who directed Youth 68? He was one of many Captain Kangaroo alumni who would work on this new show, which at the time did not have a name. Sesame Street was not the name yet. It was Stone. It took a while for them to get to Sesame Street, actually. And it was Stone's suggestion that CTW hire Jim Henson to do the puppets for the show. In fact, he basically told them, because he knew they wanted puppets on the show. They were like, this needs to be a part of the show. We need to have puppets. It's a kid's show, so we're going to have puppets. And he basically told them, he's like, listen, if you can't get Jim Henson, you shouldn't even bother putting puppets on the show at all, because what he's doing with puppets is head and shoulders above what anyone else is doing. When describing her vision for Sesame Street to the New York Times, Cooney said, I want this show to jump and move fast. Kids like commercials and banana peel humor and avant-garde video and audio techniques, which that to me, that sounds like Jim Henson to a T. Like it sounds like she's describing Jim Henson.
Like you could have just said, kids want what you do.
Yeah. Yeah. But she didn't really know who Jim Henson was yet at the time. I mean, she didn't know his name, at least. So at Stone's request, Jim Henson sat in on some of the planning workshops for the show, which were at Harvard, I think. And he was intrigued by the concept, but he was initially kind of hesitant to join because, remember, he'd spent several years expanding into film, animation, documentaries, and experimental television. And he didn't want to be known as just the puppet guy again. Like he's working hard to not be the puppet guy. And not only that, but he knew that if he was regularly appearing on a children's show, he'd be known as a children's puppeteer, which was a title that he'd been resisting for his entire career. He has spent his entire career trying to convince people that puppets could be used to entertain adults, and here he was being courted for a children's TV show.
There's always a ticking clock hovering above Jim Henson's head, and it feels like a ghost of a children's birthday party clown following behind him. Just trying to escape.
Yeah, he just, he's just got a lot of ideas, and he wants to be able to execute them, and they're not all ideas for kids. So he's got a lot that he wants to do. So he's a little hesitant at first. But luckily, for now, they didn't need Jim's Muppets, because they still had a lot of work to do before they ever even started filming the puppet stuff. They managed to secure his talents for making short films, which he loved because it gave him the chance to kind of experiment. So using the fast-paced editing style that he'd perfected on Timepiece and Youth 68, and his knack for driving home a point in a very short amount of time, which was a skill that he'd mastered making 8-second coffee commercials, Jim created a series of 1 to 2 minute inserts that were used to teach kids letters, numbers, and other concepts. Some of these were animated, stop motion animation, things like that. The King of 8 is one of my favorites. You guys seen that one? It's so catchy. Like every time I hear it, I'm like, this is good. Like I just like listening to this song. I'm learning about the number 8. There's also the Queen of 6. Is it the I think it's 6.
Yeah.
I don't want to be the guy who's just hammering in on like positivity or like look at life on the bright side. But this is a great example of all of these experiences help you along the path to like lead you somewhere. All the advertising that he hated doing or we wished he didn't have to do, that mattered here.
Yeah, it gave him the tools to do this.
Absolutely.
And Jim was uniquely suited to this work. Not only did that rat-a-tat pacing that Cooney was looking for fit with his own established aesthetics, but Jim was the father of 4 children under the age of 10 at this point. So he knew the audience. You know, he had spent countless nights playing with, talking with, doing crafts and art and stuff with his kids, listening to his children, and he knew how perceptive and receptive an audience of children could be when they weren't being condescended to.
Well, a couple of other factors to think about too here that makes Jim perfect for this. So, he as much as anyone would know the power of television or how influential a television could be to a child, because I mean, this is the kid that like bugged his dad to death to get him a TV as soon as it was available because of like how magical he perceived it to be. So he would obviously see it as a powerful tool that way. And I know it, at least Idea Man, they cover this, but his son, John, also had like kind of a learning disability.
They don't say it in Idea Man, but I think he had severe dyslexia. I think I read that maybe in the Jim Henson biography somewhere else.
Might have been in the biography, but he was kind of interested in like how kids learn and how kids can, you know, pick up that information. So I could see it being a little appealing in like those ways for him.
Well, plus, like, remember, he's always trying to push the boundaries of what television can be as an art form and what television is capable of. That's what he was doing with U68 and with even with the Cube. So what Joan Cooney was doing was experimental television. Like, nobody had ever tried to teach kids using television, to use television as a tool for education. It was just a way to like entertain kids so that they'd be out of mom and dad's hair while they're doing whatever else, you know, doing chores around the house, doing the dishes, and like, leave me alone, kid, go watch whatever, you know, go watch Howdy Doody. That's not what they were doing with Sesame Street. Like, they had very lofty expectations for what this show was capable of. Like I said before, it was practically revolutionary, and Jim wanted to be a part of that too, to show that television could be used for something greater.
I always think about that. There's like one South Park where Kyle is like talking about, because they're obviously talking about how like South Park was getting shit on by like parents and stuff like that. He's like talking to Kitty about like, I could see why parents get so upset. Like, you buy a TV and you expect it to babysit your children all the time, and then it's gonna have stuff that you don't like on it.
That's
and it's
funny.
like, you don't want to have to be responsible for that. But,
It's true though.
but it is true, and so I guess I'm thinking of that here just because it all obviously doesn't have to be educational and like super important. But it's good that there are these people that are thinking about those things and like making things that are not just for adults. And, you know, you see Jim talk about in some interviews just how he felt like there was a responsibility for people to have things that could be made for, like, if your kids are going to be sucked into TV, that there are things that are good for them to watch that actually help them.
Yeah, exactly. And so he agreed to join this new experiment in television. But there was a small speed bump along the way in that Jim insisted on owning his own characters. Jim had, in fact, always insisted on retaining ownership of his characters. Other folks that he'd partnered with in the past had tried to claim ownership of the Muppets, but Jim always put a clause in his contracts that ownership would remain with him. Back when he was making the Purina commercials with Ralph the dog, they tried to claim ownership of Ralph, but Jim stood his ground. And had he not stood his ground, Ralph wouldn't have been able to appear on the Jimmy Dean Show, and then the entire trajectory of Henson's career could have changed.
In the biography, they make it kind of sound like he kept that on the download, that had been offered. I think it was like his business manager or something had entertained the idea or something like that in that discussion, and they had offered supposedly like around like $100,000 at the time, which nowadays would be like
a lot of money.
It'd be close to $1 million. Like, you'd be in like 800,000. And the guy had talked to them about it and had come to Jim and like showed it to him. And like Jim apparently got kind of like annoyed by it and like told him, you know, don't ever try to sell my stuff.
Yeah, and he meant it. Like, he refused to do it. So CTW and their lawyers, especially their lawyers, tried to argue with Jim on this, pointing out that they'd be the ones providing the facilities and doing all the filming and post-production work. But Jim still insisted, and in the end, after a bit of back and forth, they ended up reaching an agreement that allowed Jim to maintain ownership of the characters and the ability to approve any merchandising involving his characters, or Henson Associates and CTW would split any profits made from any Muppet-related merchandise associated with the show.
This kind of reminded me of a lot of the stuff that comic book creators dealt with, thing that kind of drove things like the creation of Image Comics and eventually IDW and a lot of the quote unquote creator owned companies. There's a lot of things like this, and hats off to Jim Henson for really standing his ground, getting in there, really putting his foot down, because there's even
and being forward thinking.
yes, and being forward thinking, because this
Yeah.
is kind of this. It also kind of reminds me of like the deal George Lucas made famously with Star Wars,
The merchandising,
yeah, the
yeah.
merchandising. And I've even heard, some drag performers, they get involved with certain shows, and some of the shows try to claim their drag persona, that character, as property of that show, which is why certain performers will and won't be involved in certain productions. And to be honest, even Dungeons and Dragons, like that's what the whole OGL conflict was all about, was third-party content creators who were so thankful that the creators of D&D had this clause, the OGL, the open gaming license, that they were actually able to go and start their own companies and form their own stories using the mechanics of D&D to essentially have careers. And then when all of this was happening, a lot of that stuff was going to go away, and luckily it worked out in our favor. But yeah, this is a big deal here.
Well, it's a forward-thinking thing that, I mean, even to this day is still a problem. But like, I think we're finally in a spot now in these last like several years. Something is changing in a lot of industries. Because this is like it's every industry. It's like music, like with labels owning the songs.
Well,
and-
wrestling. I mean, for to go to your neck of the woods, Gary, wrestling. Like, I know there are wrestlers who can't use the name that they become known under in other organizations. Sure. Like Edge. Edge is in AEW now. He's going under the name Cope because he can't use the name Edge because WWE owns the name Edge. I know that when CM Punk came back to WWE years ago, part of the clause in his contract was, I own my name. I can be CM Punk anywhere. Like that, he owns the name CM Punk. And he made it a point to like say, I'm not coming back unless you guys agree to this.
There's a couple of guys that were forward, or girls that were forward thinking enough to, do that same deal, or at least have enough pull that they could do. But yeah, I mean, if you want to, like in wrestling, I remember that was a big thing with like, WWE's the Disney of the pro wrestling world, but they owned the character names. And you remember, this is going to be a deep dive for like people that don't give a shit about this, but like when Kevin Nash and Scott Hall left WWE for the rival company WCW, they went in not saying what their names were at first so that people would think like
that they're Diesel and Razor Ramon. Yeah.
And then Vince McMahon over in the WWE was trying to prove like, you're not them. They're characters I created. So then he made like two other guys come in and be those characters.
Wasn't Kane fake Diesel?
Yeah, he was.
Kane was fake Diesel. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like he tried to put like two other bodies in the character and it failed, but
did not work. Did not work in their favor.
But lots of artists, like, I mean, especially in music right now, you see this, like two guys I love, like social media is helping this happen. But two of my favorites right now are these guys, Nick D and Connor Price, but they make music exclusively like on, they put it out. They know they mastered TikTok and Instagram, and they don't have a label. They don't sell. They're like constantly on about that. Like, oh, you're not going to buy our stuff. Like we own our stuff.
This kind of is similar to the point you made with George Lucas and the merchandising deal with Star Wars, because when that deal was made, nobody thought that Star Wars was going to be worth shit. Like nobody thought it was going to be. So they were like, yeah, whatever, you can have the merchandising. Nobody's going to buy this stuff. And obviously George Lucas was more forward thinking than they were.
Yeah.
So when this deal was made between CTW and Henson, neither one of them had any idea. This was an experiment. Nobody had any idea what a merchandising monster they were creating with Sesame Street. And the partnership would end up being financially successful for everyone involved because they were splitting the profits. There was a lot of like back and forth on how they would split those. We're not going to get into the specifics of that, but it came down the line when they finally started to merchandise it. They had to like go like, well, we said we were going to split it, but like, how are we going to split it? Like, is it 50-50? It was a whole thing, but everybody got rich off of it, basically. So with that agreement out of the way, Henson was on board, and he said about creating a few short films for the show. The first one that he filmed was called Body Parts versus Heavy Equipment, and it's not experimental in any way. It's a very like educational little thing, but it basically compares movements of the body to similar movements in machines. So it shows these like kids playing in a sandbox, and they'll use their hands to pick it up, and then they'll show like a heavy machine that's doing the same thing. It's basically teaching kids about their own body parts and how they function.
I got to tell you, this was by far the most disappointing of the videos that I watched, just because the name had me, I just went in expecting something different.
Like a David Cronenberg movie or something.
Right. I wanted to see someone crushed by heavy machinery.
One of the kids in that video is Brian Henson, by the way. He's one of the little boys in it. Yeah. But yeah, it's one of the less experimental things that Henson did. I mean, a lot of the stuff he did for Sesame Street wasn't experimental, but used some of the same techniques. This one's pretty straightforward, but you can see the educational value for sure.
Going into this, the first thing I thought was like, wow, he's still getting to do this. Can you imagine if Jim Henson, like, I want to visit the alternate universe where he was just like, fuck all this, I'm making nightclubs.
Yeah, right. That whole thing fell apart. We didn't really discuss where that went, but it didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, fuck Sesame Street.
Yeah.
Jefferson Airplane is playing my club tonight.
Yeah. The whole nightclub thing just like was too ambitious, and so it just never could happen. Even though, like I said, they filmed stuff for it, but it just became, I think, too much of a thing. And then he started dealing with making the Cube and making Sesame Street and all this, that it just kind of fell to the wayside a little bit. But another thing that he created early on for Sesame Street was something he called it numerosity in his notes, but they became affectionately known by viewers as the Baker films. It was a series of short films that began with colorful animations and a little song, followed by some short live action clips of humans counting objects out loud. Like there would be like 6 bats, and they'd be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the little numbers would pop on the screen. They did this for all the numbers. I think 1 through 10, I think, is what they did. But at the end of every one of these videos, there'd be a baker that came out holding the appropriate number of desserts. So if it was like 6, it'd be like 6 strawberry shortcakes, and he'd be trying to precariously balancing 6 strawberry shortcakes. And he would say 6 strawberry shortcakes, and it was Jim Henson's voice, different actor, but Jim Henson's voice. And then he would fall down the stairs like in a pratfall. A very Jim Henson way of ending, if there ever was one. The only way it could be more Jim Henson would be if the guy exploded at the end. But it was every single one of them ended with the baker and his desserts falling down the stairs. It's very funny. I've watched all of them numerous times over the last week, and there's something about somebody falling down that's very funny to me. And his buddy, my wife always comments on how tickled I get when somebody falls down in a movie. Like when we watch Elf and he gets hit by the taxi, it gets me every time. I've seen that movie 25 times, and and I know it's coming, and I like pay attention because I know it's coming, and every single time he gets hit by that car, I just laugh. It's so funny to me to see somebody fall down. I don't know why. I don't want to see
especially
get,
with
like, seriously hurt, but it's funny.
It would, it'd be a little different if his shin was poking out of the skin of his leg. But
exactly.
but it is funny, like if he's got a cake and then there's cake everywhere, and he's just like picking up globs of cake.
Yeah, it's very funny.
I will say though that's exactly why I was disappointed by the body parts versus heavy equipment one, because there was not like at one point like somebody saying like 1 steamroller and they getting crushed,
just getting squished. Yeah, I think the verses in the versus heavy equipment is what sets those expectations. Where it's like
terrible title,
like your arm versus I don't know,
wood chipper.
Yeah, who's gonna win?
Oh God!
Right, exactly.
Well, another project that Jim helped work on early on in the Sesame Street thing was a pitch reel. This is a pitch reel that would be shown to public television stations all across the country, kind of a way to show them what the show was going to be, learn more about it before its premiere later on that year. So in early 1968, Jim taped the Muppet portions of this. It was a 25-minute pitch reel. The Muppets take up about 5 or 5 or 6 minutes of that probably. And he used his most well-known Muppet creations at the time, which were Kermit and Ralph as the MCs.
I keep going back to the idea of thinking of execs in like business suits and their leather briefcases, and they're just like hanging out, and somebody's like, "Here, this is our pitch," and they show it. And I watched this whole thing, and it is just like Kermit and Ralph like sitting there like, so anyway, well, this show we're gonna have this. Oh, that sounds crazy, Ralph. Like, well, and I'm just like these business execs being like, what the fuck is going on right
Plus,
now?
it makes fun of business execs at one point because it has this scene of all these executives around a table, and they're all Muppets trying to think of a name for the show because which was a thing, because remember it took them a while to come up with Sesame Street.
Yeah.
And they're like throwing around names, and they're all like terrible. Like they're all terrible names. One guy even says like, "Well, these kids don't know how to read yet, right? Why don't we just call it Hey Stupid?" It's really funny. And then I guess that's when they announced the title Sesame Street, because it's on the street and it's like open sesame to a world of imagination and learning and all this stuff. But that's all in the pitch reel, and it's very funny. It's really funny.
No, it's good. It's just, it's just not what you picture like in a board meeting, you know?
Yeah, but this is Jim Henson has his own way. Although I guess this wasn't his idea. He was just hired to do it this way, but it is very much his sense of humor though. Like they definitely let him do jokes that he was kind of known for at this point. The "Hey Stupid" joke is hilarious to me because he knew that kids were never going to see this, and it was meant for adults. So like them saying, we could just put the title "Hey Stupid" on the screen, and these dumb kids can't read it because they're not old enough to read yet. That's really funny to me.
It's clearly a shout out to like, that vaudevillian, which eventually the Muppet Show is clearly a love letter to vaudeville type variety shows.
Mm-hmm.
But you can clearly see the influence of that type of entertainment. Just love it.
I do too. So Jim's next order of business was to come up with some new original Muppets, because it wasn't going to be Ralph and Kermit, although Kermit became kind of a staple on the show for a while. So they wanted to come up with some new Muppets that were exclusive to the show, basically. And Don Salen was going to be in charge of their construction based on Jim's designs. And the first ones that he came up with were another kind of classic Henson creation, the contrasting duo, one tall and one short. Think of Wilkins and Wontkins, right? The design of them, how they're kind of contrasting. Yeah. One's kind of short and round, one's tall and skinny. These were the ones that he created here. One had a long kind of banana-shaped head. The other one had a wide, flat, football-shaped head. They were, of course, one of our greatest comedy duos, one of the greatest comedy duos of all time, in my opinion, up there with Laurel and Hardy. This is Bert and Ernie.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
They are. I've been watching a lot of Sesame Street this week, and the stuff that like is genuinely like a lot of it's genuinely really funny. Yeah. But the Bert and Ernie stuff is so funny to me, and it's Jim Henson and Frank Oz. Jim Henson's Ernie, Frank Oz's Bert, and they just play off each other so well.
It's the Odd Couple.
Yeah. It really is.
It just works. It just hits on all cylinders, man.
Yeah, they went back and forth on like who was going to play who, but ultimately Jim was like the more playful person. Frank was the more uptight person.
It makes sense for them to play who they ended up playing. Yeah.
So they match up to their counterpart. Like Frank Oz, I think it's an idea, man. There's a part with him just saying like, that's how we were. Like Jim was the guy that if you threw us in a canoe in the river, Jim pulls in the oars and lets the river just take him where it's going to take him. And I'm the guy who's like paddling furiously upstream
against the current. Yeah. It's such a great dynamic because that was like their real life dynamic. And, Ernie is like very like playful and silly, and Bert like is sort of exasperated by him. And it's one of the first ones I watched was one where where Ernie has like a cookie on the table, and Bert's like, why is that cookie sitting on the table? Well, the cookie's on the table because it reminds me of this. Well, why does it remind you of this? Well, that reminds me of this. And he goes on in this big circle where it ends up being something completely different about like what time he's supposed to get up in the morning, but he had to take the long road to get there.
Yeah.
But at one point, Bert says, I can't believe I'm asking this. I'm going to regret it. And it's such like a thing that it feels like Frank Oz probably made it up on the spot, because it's definitely like an adult joke, not an adult and like inappropriate, just in like adults are going to think that's funny because they've probably had similar interactions with their children where they're like, I can't believe I have to ask why, but why? His comic delivery is both of them, but like Bert is, if I'm picking a favorite Sesame Street character, Bert's probably my favorite, probably because I'm a little bit of a Bert. me and my wife are Bert and Ernie.
Oh my God, that's so
100%.
perfect. Oh,
that's insanely accurate. That's
really
so weird. Here's another irrational childhood fear I had involving Muppets. I remember as a small child feeling like Bert was the scariest Muppet to me because he looked like he would bite you.
He does look real bitey. Have you ever seen his like derpy looking cousin who has like this craggly teeth?
Oh, I don't think so.
Oh no.
They've got him on display at the Center for Puppetry Arts in Atlanta.
Oh, so maybe I've seen him, but I don't.
Yeah, his name is Brad. He looks like
Oh Jesus. That definitely looks like he would bite you. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, look at that kid. I don't remember seeing him on the show, but I do remember seeing him in person and going like, ugh, that's the kid you stay away from. That kid stinks. I can tell.
I was looking at these images you threw into our notes here, and like with Ernie having like Jim Henson mostly like with one of his arms in the main body, but then the other guy's like behind him operating the right arm. I'm like, man, you really had to count on each other to have good hygiene. Like,
They like Jim Henson better have some deodorant on, or that guy, his face is right in Jim's armpit.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very close. So in the original pilot for Sesame Street, they actually filmed the Muppets and real humans completely separately. That was the original plan. They were worried that preschool age children would have a hard time differentiating between fantasy and reality. So the humans would exist on the street, while the Muppets were featured in their own standalone segments. Like when you see Bert and Ernie in their apartment or whatever, or you see Cookie Monster on the little brick wall. Like that's the only way they were planning on showing the Muppets originally. And then they would cut to the other scenes of the street where the humans would be talking or whatever. So the result was they did some like test screenings, and the Muppet scenes went over very, very well. Kids loved them. They were really into them. And then they cut to the street and they were just bored to tears, because how do you compete with the Muppets?
Yeah.
How do you throw a bunch of boring adults on a street and then like, wait, bring back the Muppets? Like, why are we go back? I don't want to be on this dirty street with these people. I want to go back to the Muppets. So
nothing enthralls children more than adults standing around talking. Yeah.
So the solution was pretty clear. The Muppets needed to be on the street interacting with the human characters. So they needed to create Muppets that could do that could be out on the street. And Jim had a few ideas for how to pull this off, including a character who he hoped would represent the children in the audience. One that was essentially a child himself, and one that could, in Jim's words, make the same kind of dumb mistakes that kids make. The Muppet ended up being the one that would become synonymous with Sesame Street. He is essentially the mascot, if you want to call it, of Sesame Street. And we are talking, of course, about Big Bird.
I saw that like early versions of Big Bird, they kind of portray him as sort of this doop-de-doop-de-doo kind of
like a yokel.
Yeah, like a dumb guy type thing, but like and it probably didn't take too long, but like that this gigantic bird would sort of come to embody the childlike spirit, like that childlike innocence, which I think was a brilliant move.
I think so too. Early on in like season 1, Big Bird, he looks a little different. He's got a lot less feathers on his head.
Yeah.
And he's real derpy, I don't know how else to describe him other than derpy looking.
Yeah.
Like he looks pretty stupid with the little dumb head.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was more of like a country yokel. He kind of walked with this sort of like silly thing with his head. Like he was like Gomer Pyle of the street. And they learned pretty early on, and the guy who we'll talk about in a second, but the guy who portrayed Big Bird, it was actually his idea to change it. By season 2, I think they had already made the change. They redesigned him, and he became essentially a giant like 4-year-old, so that he could ask questions, like a kid would ask without seeming like it's an adult asking silly questions or whatever. Like he wanted to be essentially another child. Like, and he makes mistakes. He says the wrong names. Like he calls Mr. Hooper Mr. Looper multiple times across the series. Like that's kind of a recurring thing where he gets names wrong and things like that.
We talked a little bit about condescending to children. Big Bird is the biggest thing on Sesame Street, and it's interesting because I think it offers that perspective of like, just because adults are bigger than you, that doesn't mean they have it all together. Like, it's
Very
okay.
true, yeah.
It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to be curious about things. And it's okay to not understand something, ask that question and learn. And that's so great.
Yeah. I mean, Big Bird, one of the main things he does is asks questions, because he is like an avatar for children. That he'll talk to the adults and they'll kind of explain things to him.
Yep.
Well, another character that was created as an occupant on the street was one that was kind of the antithesis to Big Bird's wide-eyed innocence. This was a cynical, complaining grouch by the name of Oscar. Another favorite of mine on Sesame Street.
I can see
Love
why.
Oscar. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a lot in common.
Matches your personality.
Love trash.
I imagine and we'll get there, but I imagine, with some of the adult sensibilities in the writing and the humor, that Oscar was a little bit of a pressure release of just kind of, here you get to kind of lash out a little bit and have a little bit of a cutting sense of humor to kind of, it's very silly, but at the same time, it's very fun to play.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh no, Oscar was always one of my favorites. And this is what I'm talking about. Like this one change, like I think did everything. I've said it like a million times now, but the street feels like an actual street that like people live there in these apartments, and like and this fucking bird is walking around interacting. And when you're a little kid, I'm sorry, I'm just like watching it, I'm like, that's not a guy in a suit. Look at his neck. Like
Look at him. Yeah. How could it possibly be a guy in a suit?
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. Oscar's can opens up at the bottom and it goes down into a fucking mansion of trash. He's got all kinds of shit down there.
And also, like, just the fact that it's all on the street on this kind of like these brownstones, it looks like kind of like the inner city, was a revolutionary move. And it was John Stone's idea, and it was because they were trying to reach kids who were in that demographic, who lived in the inner city and didn't have access to a lot of other educational resources, and they wanted it to look like something they were familiar with. They didn't want it to be in storybook land or some fantasy land. They wanted it to be in the real world where these kids existed. And I mean, it seems like a no-brainer now, but like at the time, that was considered pretty revolutionary.
Yeah, no, it's great. It was the ultimate move. I mean, it just felt like, I don't know, it's fascinating to look at. And then while you're looking at it, then they've got all this other stuff going on, like where you actually learn some shit. Yeah. There's always like it feels like there was always like an overarching story that was happening in the episode or something. Yeah. And it would cut to these segments. I just can't imagine like how much different it would be if like they had just tried to make the Muppets separate, but by making the Muppets like part of the regular thing, it made all the difference. It made it magic.
Yeah, it did.
From a production standpoint, it makes sense. The puppets, kids are very attracted to that sort of thing. But like, I wonder if there's a subtle, and again, we know I like to read into things, maybe even too much, but like, I wonder if this is sort of getting out there the idea of there's people out there that are different than you, and that's okay. Like it's okay to ask questions, and we can all, the human cast on Sesame Street was all very different.
Oh yeah. Oscar, by the way, the original sketches from Jim Henson, he painted him as purple, kind of magenta. And then in the first season of Sesame Street, he was actually orange, and then they changed him to green by season 2. And in fact, Oscar, he's been asked about that in interviews. Oscar has, about why he's green and he used to be orange, and he says that it's just moss. He just has never taken a bath. So if he were to bathe, he would actually be orange underneath.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I love that.
So the question now was, who was going to be the puppeteers for these characters, Big Bird and Oscar? Jim's intention was that the same puppeteer would perform both characters. And while he was happy to perform in Muppet sketches and inserts, he was not willing to devote himself to being on set to perform for the 130 or so episodes that CTW planned to film every year.
Jeez.
That's a lot. It's a lot. That's a big commitment. He had other things that he wanted to do, obviously. So he flirted with the idea of asking Frank Oz to do it, but Oz, remember, he had hated performing in the full body walk around LaChoy dragon costume. He hated it. And a similar design was being planned for Big Bird, so that was out. So besides, Oz was too important to the Muppets overall to spare for 130 taping days. Like he had other things to do. So once again, Jim went off to the Puppeteers of America conference. Seems to be where he likes to recruit people, and that was why one of the reasons he went there was to find somebody to take on the task of being Big Bird and Oscar. And it was there that Jim approached a 35-year-old puppeteer named Carol Spinney about the job. He saw Spinney perform in a kind of a disastrous performance, but Jim appreciated what he was trying to do and asked him to join the team. And Spinney, of course, knew who Jim Henson was, because I think everyone at Puppeteers of America, Jim Henson was the president of the Puppeteers.
He became president.
Yeah, I think he had already given up that job by this time, but for a couple of years he was the president. Yeah,
he hit it like 25, and I think he was like the youngest person to ever be the president.
And I think he was president for 2 or 3 years, maybe, but then he's too busy, so he gave it up. But obviously Carol Spinney knew who he was, and Spinney enthusiastically joined the team, and he would perform as Big Bird and Oscar on Sesame Street from 1969, season 1, up until his retirement in 2018 at the age of 84.
Insane.
Isn't that nuts?
And you see the brother like holding up Oscar the Grouch in his Big Bird shoes.
Yeah.
And, it's just crazy.
Doing one and then the other. It's really remarkable. A remarkable career.
Yeah. I mean, this goes to support the whole idea of like doing something that you love. It kind of naturally preserves you. Like, and I mean, because it's a physically demanding job. Like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. You're not
very.
Yeah, you're not sitting at a desk. They are performing
and holding your hand over your head for hours at a time. Like I can imagine what that would do to my neck and oh man, yeah.
Yeah. When most people are thinking about getting out, 55, 60, maybe a little bit, and he goes till he's 84.
And he didn't start till he was 35.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he wasn't like, he was 20 years old when he started. And he had an apprentice later on in his career who would do some scenes for him, but he was still working. And he passed away a year after he retired. So he died at the age of 85.
Bless him. Jeez.
Well, Carol Spinney was one of many new recruits to the Muppet workforce during this time, because remember, they're kind of growing by leaps and bounds at this time. Back at Henson Associates, a few other talented folks had been added to the lineup, including puppeteer Carolyn Wilcox and the wonderfully named Kermit Love, who was a marionettist and former Broadway costume designer who was particularly adept at crafting full-body Muppets. And it was Love who was responsible for constructing the complex Big Bird puppet / costume alongside Don Salen. Don Salen did more of the head stuff, and I think Kermit Love did more of the body. Kermit Love also looks like Santa Claus. Like he's got a big white beard. His name is Kermit Love. How could you not work for the Muppets?
Yeah.
How could you not? So Jerry Jewell, who had actually moved to California. He'd left the Muppets Incorporated a while back. He'd moved to California to pursue a career as a freelance writer. He was coaxed back into the Muppet fold by Henson and John Stone, who kind of knew that nobody else understood the rhythm of the Muppets quite like Jerry Jewell. Remember, Jerry Jewell had been hired as a performer, but then he had become such a good writer that he kind of fell into being mostly a writer at this point. And they knew that like Jerry Joel could just write for the Muppets. Like he understood them. He understood the rhythm of their jokes and their dialogue, and nobody else quite could do it the way that he did, except for maybe Jim Henson. But even Jim Henson would probably say that Jerry Joel did it better than he did. So after a little bit of persuading, he agreed to join Sesame Street as a writer, and he would actually stay in California. That was part of the agreement. He would stay in California. He would just mailed in scripts from California to New York where they were filming for the next 5 years. He'd come over to New York every now and then when he needed to check in person, but mostly he was writing from California. And, they didn't have email and stuff, so they didn't have faxes yet. So he's literally mailing stuff through the mail, scripts for Sesame Street for 5 years. Well, Sesame Street debuted nationally on November 10th, 1969, and it was an immediate hit. By December, so, the next month, Big Bird was already making an appearance on Ed Sullivan. By the following November, he was on the cover of Time magazine. Big Bird was on the cover of Time magazine. The show went on to win a Peabody Award and 3 Emmy Awards that year. Yeah, year one.
Yeah.
And as we all know, Sesame Street has become one of the most watched TV shows of all time, with multiple generations of children growing up with Big Bird and the Cookie Monster and Grover and Elmo and Ernie and Bert. The show has gone on to win 222 Emmys, 11 Grammys, and is broadcast in over 140 countries, with many countries creating their own versions of the show, each catered to their home country's unique culture. I am fascinated by the international versions of Sesame Street characters. Just go look up pictures of like Big Birds from around the world. There are other characters as well, but Big Bird there are multiple versions of Big Bird and multiple Grouches and things like that. It's fascinating. It's really cool. And I think there's like 40 different versions of Sesame Street broadcast in different countries that are produced in different countries, not just this one being broadcast, but like I think it's about 40 different Sesame Streets. Like there's like an Australian Sesame Street and a British one and a French one. And like, they're all over the place, but they're, produced specifically for that culture. It's really cool.
Wow.
And also just the idea of them like redesigning certain characters to fit the culture is fascinating to me. I don't know. It's something I've always found really interesting.
Yeah.
So go do a quick Google search of that and you'll see what I'm talking about. But I mean, it is really hard to understate the impact of Sesame Street. I know it's weird that like 3 dudes in their 40s are talking at length about a show made for 3 to 5 year olds, but it just tells you the staying power of this show. And it is like I said, I've watched a lot of Sesame Street this week. It's all there's a lot of it on HBO Max. I've been watching a lot of stuff from basically the 70s, like this early version of it when Jim Henson was still working on it. It's still funny. Like there are jokes that are genuinely funny to adults, and the experimental short films and things like that that Jim Henson, among other people, did. It's made for kids, but they set out to do what they wanted to do, and they wanted it to be entertaining for adults. And as an adult, I can attest that I'm still entertained by it. Now, some of there's a degree of nostalgia because there was a lot of these like segments that I remember watching when I was a kid, and I enjoyed them then, so I enjoy them now. But there are also jokes that went way over my head when I was a kid that now I watch them and I crack up because those are the jokes that they made for the moms and dads and older siblings who were watching.
Well, and I think it speaks, again, talking about, something speaking to all ages universally and continuously over a great length of time. Let's be honest. If you hear someone start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're just gonna 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
And now that song's in my head for the rest of the day. Yeah.
and to be honest, like even if somebody for whatever reason, if it was playing anywhere near you, you're gonna kind of crane your neck a little bit because I want to watch that ball zip around those different landscapes and
it's a great animation
and hear the song and it's I'll watch that anytime. It's just great.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about the guy responsible for the music here in a second, but the music is a big part of it too. Like the People in Your Neighborhood song, I've been singing that all day.
These are the people in your neighborhood.
Yeah, it's been stuck in my head all day today, and I've been singing it. But I've changed the lyrics to be about my dogs, as we do.
Oh, that's perfect.
It's called "These Are the Puppies in My Neighborhood." If anyone's wondering.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
I'm not going to sing it here, not even for our Cinema Shock Plus subscribers. So
Oh.
you get to hear me sing. But get a couple beers in me, and then maybe. But,
get in the comments, subscribers.
but Sesame Street did set out to do exactly what Cooney had hoped. It made education fun. It made it accessible, even to children who had few other resources. And like studies showed that it worked. Like these children, they started testing better. Children who grew up on Sesame Street tested better. Like it literally is making the world a better place. You can't say that about a lot of TV shows. It changed the face of television. It changed children's entertainment and how we approach education, meeting young children on their level and teaching without condescension. I think that's the really important part. It's not being condescending to kids.
Yeah.
It's not. I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that Sesame Street is one of the most important television shows ever created, and its success was largely due. Not solely due, but largely due to Henson's and his Muppets contributions. So while Sesame Street was becoming a phenomenon, Henson continued to pursue other projects as well. In fact, around the time of Sesame Street's debut in late 1969 or so, he appeared on Ed Sullivan, which he had appeared on a lot, but he actually had a new routine on Ed Sullivan with a new Muppet that centered around a song called Mana Mana, which would go on to be the first ever skit to appear on The Muppet Show. So he did that around this, and The Muppet Show doesn't come around for another decade, actually.
I gotta say, I'm really proud of myself and Gary that when Justin said phenomenon, that neither one of us broke into song. I'm impressed by our maturity and control. Going do 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 do.
Phenomena.
Mana, which he got from like an Italian horror movie, I think, that him and Frank Oz had seen. Yeah, it's from like an Italian horror movie that him and Frank Oz saw in New York. And there was a song in it. That song is in it, which seems weird, but I mean, because we all know it from the Muppets, but that he first heard it in some like Italian exploitation movie of some sort. I can't remember the name.
Sweden, Heaven and Hell. A song by Italian composer Piero Umiliani.
Se il club Salomè è la faccia stanca della Svezia, questo è il risvolto pulito della medaglia.
Jeez.
One of those like Mondo movies probably that were coming around at that time, but yeah, very weird.
It was about lesbian nightclubs, pornography, and a swinging lifestyle is what it says.
Sounds awesome.
But catchy as hell. And so,
Catchy as
like,
hell.
Yeah. It just like gets in your head when you're least expecting it. I have to give you the Wikipedia for Sweden, Heaven and Hell. The last two paragraphs are this. The film is made up of 9 segments focusing on different aspects of sexuality in Sweden, such as lesbian nightclubs, pornography, swinging lifestyle of married couples, the sex education of teenagers. It also examines drug addiction, alcoholism, and suicide in Sweden. Also features the debut song Mana Mana by Piero Illuminati that was popularized by the Muppets. Lesbian nightclubs, pornography, swinging lifestyle, drug addiction, alcoholism, suicide, and has that song in the Muppets.
So, further viewing, if you're a fan of the Muppets, our recommendation is Sweden, Heaven and Hell, directed by Luigi Scantini. Yes, okay. Well, I'm going to leave that on the free feed. So that's just a glimpse of what you get as a Cinema Shocks Plus subscriber.
Right.
That sort of gold star recommendation.
I like the idea of Jim Henson and Frank Oz together in a theater watching whatever the fuck that movie is. Yeah.
I just thought it was a travel log about Sweden.
Oh wow, Frank! This is a lot different than I expected, Frank.
That's where he got the voice for the Swedish Chef. Was from.
Oh my god!
Was from that movie because it was a movie about Sweden, but directed by an Italian. So he didn't know what Swedish people sounded like. So he cast an Italian actor as a Swede, and they just went.
That's an exact quote they use from a sex scene in that movie.
It makes you think of things like pork, 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 pork. Oh no. Oh no.
And it's
Wow.
probably true.
That's the
Oh.
thing. It might. Hey, inspiration is all around us. You know.
I guess so.
Yeah. So he did that on Ed Sullivan around this time, and then he was working on some other stuff. In the wake of Sesame Street's success, ABC showed interest in reviving a Muppet project that had been shelved a couple years prior, because Sesame Street's a big deal, so now everyone wants to do this stuff that they had passed on.
Of course.
But this one was a fairy tale satire called Hey Cinderella, and Hey Cinderella had been based on the basic outline from the failed Cinderella pilot that Henson and John Stone had collaborated on when they first met. So they kind of reworked that into this thing. And Jim was thrilled with ABC's decision to pick it up, as he'd hoped to make the hour-long special, the first in a regular series called Tales from Muppet Land, which would all be like, kind of fairy tale-y kind of things, but they would feature a wraparound segment starring Kermit that could be inserted before the commercial break. So he's sort of the host there, So did either of you have a chance to watch the Hey Cinderella thing?
I didn't. I skimmed through it.
That's what
to be
I kind of
honest with you.
skimmed through it. Yeah, I did the same thing on that one. I kind of skimmed through it, and it's pretty interesting. But it is like, think of like, I don't know, some of the later Muppet movies like Muppet Treasure Island or Christmas Carol, where they're inserting Muppets into a well-known story kind of thing, which Jim
Right.
Henson really didn't do with any of his movies. His movies are all set kind of within the real world, for lack of better term, but you know what I mean, present day and all that. But this one is kind of like he's inserting the Muppets into a classic story, a classic piece of literature. So it's kind of interesting in that way. But yeah, it's it's worth, if you're a Jim Henson historian or you're into the history of the Muppets, like this is another very early pre-Muppet show, pre-Muppet movie appearance. And it's about an hour? No, it's about half an hour long. An hour
Yeah,
long.
it was like an hour.
I think it's an hour long. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're a Henson head, it's worth checking out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I will say, like, in Idea Man, they talk briefly about this like period though that like I think it was an Idea Man or either the biography. Again, I get them mixed up, but then this was a good period for him learning like more about storytelling though, that like he learned like structure of like getting a complete story out there or something.
Right.
So-
Yeah. As opposed to just doing little skits, like he was
Right.
doing on Sam and Friends.
Yeah.
Well, another long gestating project that he was able to get off the ground at this time, again, largely due because Sesame Street was such a big hit, was one called The Great Santa Claus Switch. And this was another hour-long production that he and Jerry Jewell had been working on for about 7 years. Like, they had not been able to do anything with it, but they've been working on it off and on for 7 years. And then finally, in 1970, Ed Sullivan, of all people, he had been impressed with Jim's appearances on the show, so he agreed to produce this thing. Now, the Great Santa Claus Switch was Jim's most ambitious Muppet-related project to date. As far as like the sheer size of the production, the number of Muppets, like there were a ton of Muppets, like monsters, like Muppet monsters, and a lot more walk-around characters than what he normally had. There are a lot of really cool Muppet monsters in this one. And as such, because it was so big, it was going to require more personnel than Jim had. They were stretching all their resources pretty thin on this one, as far as what they were capable of doing with the team that they had in place. So they had to hire some new people. And those new hires included Fran Brill and Richard Hunt, both of whom would work on Sesame Street for decades. Gary, earlier you commented on a photo of Jim Henson and Frank Oz as Bert and Ernie. And there's another guy who has his kind of face in Jim Henson's armpit, and he's playing the other hand of Ernie, and that is Richard Hunt. Richard Hunt was a major contributor to the Muppets, but especially Sesame Street. The Great Santa Claus Switch is cool. Like, if you have a chance to watch it, it's a Christmas thing, obviously. So, watch it around Christmas time next year when you watch Muppet Christmas Carol, Muppet Family Christmas. Throw the Great Santa Claus Switch in there because it's got some really cool looking Muppets in it. And it was a pretty successful show when it came out in December of 1970. It received great reviews. Reviewers were particularly fond of two gigantic walk-around Muppets Jim had created for the show called Thog and Thig. You've seen Thig. I think it's Thig. He's the purple one because he's at the very beginning of the Muppet Show. Big walk around purpley thing. You've seen
okay.
him, even if you don't. I didn't know his name until I looked him up, but Google him. I guarantee you've seen him. But the most enduring Muppet to appear on the Great Santa Claus Switch was a little purple hook-nosed creature named Snarl. But when he was recycled for the Muppet Show a few years later, Snarl would be known by another name, the Great Gonzo.
We've done a good job of highlighting some wonderful stunt performers, stunt men and women over the years that really put themselves on the line for their art. People like Evel Knievel and Super Dave Osborne, Stuntman Mike, of course. But I think all of them would attribute their careers, if not at least some inspiration, to probably the greatest stunt performer of all time, the Great Gonzo.
I like that you threw Stuntman Mike in there as well, a fictional
absolutely.
character.
Yeah.
As if Super Dave Osborne is a real guy.
Yeah. But Gonzo.
Okay, yeah, Gonzo's the real deal.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I've seen that little guy shot out of a cannon.
Yeah.
This is a big start for his career, and it's cool to talk about him. I'm sure we'll talk about it more, including like when we get into the darker side of Gonzo and
his cocaine addiction and
his cocaine addiction, and he fucked many a chicken.
Yeah, he has quite the love nest, you could say.
That's all the time we have on Cinema Shock.
I feel like Jim
Thanks
Henson
so
would
much.
be proud of that joke. Man, I do love Gonzo, but anyway, we will obviously get to more Gonzo later on. As work on Sesame Street's second season began, Jim had all but abandoned the world of advertising. He was just kind of over it, honestly. He was feeling increasingly unsure about using the Muppets to sell other people's products, especially when some of the Muppets were now used for educational purposes, so he felt a little weird about that. And for a while, he was even resistant to the idea of selling his own products. Even after Sesame Street became a smash hit, the idea of merchandising it kind of bothered him. He would actually say, he told people, he said, you can't take advantage of the love the kids have for these characters. But his agent was eventually able to talk him into it, noting that his agreement with CTW stated that Jim would have final approval of any merch featuring his characters, and also pointing out that if it all worked out like he thought it would, Henson would be financially independent enough that he could pursue other avenues of creativity without having to worry about how to finance it. I think he also tugged on Jim's heartstrings a little bit and was like, the kids love these. They love these characters, yes, but that just means they want to have these characters. They want to have toys of these characters.
Yeah.
Like that was another selling point that he gave to Jim. So Jim obviously eventually relented and allowed them to create Sesame Street merchandise. And in the first year alone, Sesame Street related merchandise generated more than $5 million, which would be about $40 million today. By the mid 1970s, that number had doubled. Jeez. Now, while that amount was split between the merchandise manufacturers, CTW, and Henson, Henson's share was enough that he was able to pursue other projects, regardless of whether or not they were, set to be profitable right off the bat.
I get it. It's tough. I mean, he seems like a legitimately good guy, so he's like wanting to not take advantage of people. And but yeah, there's an opportunity there for merchandising, and that's, I don't know. I appreciate how honorable he sounds.
Yeah. I was gonna say, oh man.
But also
at the same time,
$40 million.
You own this IP, and you could make millions,
yeah, and be able to do all the weird shit that you have in your head that you want to do, because he's got a lot of big ideas. And when I say he had a big ideas, like he has some very ambitious ideas in mind. One of his key collaborators during this period, we mentioned him briefly earlier, but it was a Harvard-educated musical virtuoso named Joe Raposo. He had been hired by Children's Television Workshop to create songs for Sesame Street. John Stone had hired him. Now, it cannot be overstated how important Raposo's contributions were to the show. We have already mentioned several of the songs that get stuck in our head from this, but in addition to the series' iconic theme song, which we will, like Gary said, you will be on your deathbed, and you're going to be like 95 years old on your deathbed, and you will remember that song. You will remember the Sesame Street theme song, 100%. But he also wrote many of the show's most popular and enduring songs like C is for Cookie, Sing, which I love. It's great. It was later a hit for the Carpenters, although I hate the Carpenters, but I love the version that's on Sesame Street. And of course, Being Green, a song that, along with Rainbow Connection, has become synonymous with the character of Kermit the Frog. And Being Green is one of my favorite songs in all of Muppet history.
Oh, yeah.
Sesame Street, the
that's
Muppets,
amazing.
anything. It's incredible. So Joe Raposo and John Stone there was a bar that they would hang out with, like after work, they'd go to a bar and talk about the show and things that they needed. And John Stone just told him, he's like, hey, I need a song for a frog. I need a song for a frog. What do you got? He's like, how about we write a song about how Kermit feels? And that was basically all he gave him. And then he comes up with this song, which is a song that can mean so many things. I mean, it's clearly about race. It's clearly about just learning to love yourself. Like, it is an incredibly inspirational song. Not only that, but it's like catchy. You know, it was covered by Frank Sinatra like a year after it was on Sesame Street. You know, like it's crazy. And the Frank Sinatra version is very good.
Yeah, it kills.
The guy's a hell of a singer.
Yeah.
I don't know. You guys know.
Hopefully he gets recognized for it.
Yeah, one day.
Someday.
Yeah,
was
someday.
Was it Frank Sinatra you said?
Frank Sinatra. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
okay. All
Old
right.
Blue Eye. He's also known as Old Blue Eyes.
That's a stupid name.
It's because of his eye color.
All right.
Yeah.
That makes sense though.
But yeah, Being Green, it's a wonderful song. It really is every time. And they did it multiple times on Sesame Street over the years, but there's something about that song that's really special to me. I think because it can be seen as a song that's just about a frog accepting that he's green.
Yeah.
But if you like really listen to it, it's like it can be about almost any insecurity that a person has.
Yep.
And the fact that he just like knocked it off on a afternoon,
Yeah.
it's insane to me.
It's almost the epitome of the statement of genius and simplicity. Like, it's such a simple concept, and that song will be played and analyzed forever.
I mean, and so many of Raposo's songs are just that. I mean, that is one of the most iconic, but C is for Cookie. Obviously everyone knows. Sing a song, you know, being there. These are the people in my neighborhood, which we were talking about earlier. And Rubber Ducky, You're the One. Like, I think he wrote that one, you know, for Ernie, and like just classic after classic, banger after banger, honestly, from Joe Raposo. Raposo would become one of Jim's regular collaborators, including on the next installment of Tales from Muppetland, which was to be an adaptation of the fairy tale The Frog Prince. So for this production, this was considerably less ambitious than The Great Santa Claus Switch, which, remember, that kind of like pushed them to their limits on the amount of Muppets that were in it. For this one, because it was smaller, Jim was able to cast several pre-existing Muppets that had been created for Tales of Tinkerdy, like the King in it, which is this like cigar chomping looking guy as the King. That was for Tales of Tinkerdy. He reused him here. Although he did create a few new Muppets, some of which would become regulars, including Robin the Frog, Little Robin, and Sweetums the Ogre, which is this enormous walk-around Muppet. And if we're keeping score, my personal favorite Muppet. Reviews for The Frog Prince were great. Once again, he's getting great reviews, Jim Henson is. And one thing started to become very clear, and it's that it wasn't just kids watching this stuff. Jim's Muppet productions were being enjoyed by both children and adults, a fact that thrilled Jim, who had never set out to be a purely children's entertainer. This is all he ever wanted, was to have puppetry seen as like an art form that everyone could enjoy. This is not just kids stuff. And with that in mind, he decided to take his Muppets to the most adult venue of all time, Las Vegas. We're going to Vegas.
Yeah.
So Jim had actually been contacted by Nancy Sinatra, who was planning a show in Vegas.
Any relation to the singer?
The other Sinatra, Frank? Yeah, that's his daughter.
Frank.
Obviously Frank Sinatra had been a fixture in Vegas. And so she was kind of like wanting to do something similar. Obviously, her music's very different, but it's Vegas is a Sinatra kind of town, you know. So she was planning this new Vegas show and wanted the Muppets to be a part of it because they were kind of a hot commodity right now, right? So she invited them along. Jim agreed. He thought that would be really cool. It was kind of going in the more adult direction that he wanted to go with the Muppets. And after weeks of rehearsal, Sinatra's show opened in the summer of 1971, and it was a huge hit, with a lot of critics agreeing that the Muppets were the star attraction. She had like I think Frank Jr. was there. Sugar Ray Leonard was part of the show. Like it was a star-studded affair, but the Muppets were like the stars of the show.
Nice.
And creating a show for the stage was a lot different than creating one for TV because Jim had to work bigger so that his Muppets could be seen all over this 1,500 seat auditorium. It was the biggest auditorium in Vegas at the time. And he created oversized versions of his Mana characters, which opened the show. He also debuted one of his most ambitious creations yet, a 2-story tall insect-like creature that Jim affectionately called Boss Man, since its routine in the show was to dance and sing to the blues tune Big Boss Man.
He does look sick, first of all.
Oh, it's cool. He looks like he's kind of made of pipe cleaners almost, like his
Yeah.
big, long, spangly legs. And updated versions of that character were used on the Muppet Show later on. But really wild-looking puppet.
Yeah, just again innovative, just like him with those that like fucking thing he has on operating.
Well, he has to wear them, and also he's visible. The puppeteer has to be visible. The way that this thing is controlled which was also kind of innovative at the time. Usually puppeteers, you tried to hide the puppeteer, and Jim was all about not hiding the fact that hey, this is a performance. There is somebody controlling this thing, and and you're going to see me on stage. So you could see Jim on stage dancing with this character. It
reminds me a little bit of like if you go to see The Lion King on Broadway kind of thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. The
Yeah.
Lion King, Avenue Q did it as well, where you could see the puppeteers.
That's right.
So what Jim was doing at the time was pretty innovative, and people may have thought it was weird at the time, and now it's kind of commonplace. Like seeing the puppeteers at The Lion King on Broadway is honestly part of the joy of watching that show. And they turn the puppeteers into performers, like they're in costume and everything, and to where they become part of the performance. And this was sort of like the first time anyone had really tried to do something like that. It's a wild looking. I tried so hard to find footage from this Nancy Sinatra show, and it just doesn't seem to exist. I guess it was never filmed or anything, which is a shame that nobody ever
That is too bad.
filmed a single performance of it. But I couldn't find anything. All you can find are a couple behind the scenes images of Jim working with the Big Boss Man puppet. But Jim, he loved working the show. He loved working in Vegas. He was energized by being able to perform live again. It also worked as a trial run of sorts for Jim to know what would and wouldn't work on stage in front of a live audience. Information that he would use for his next big project, which was to be a full-on Broadway show starring the Muppets. And it's with Jim's journey to the bright lights of Broadway that we will pick up in part 3 of our series on Jim Henson.
So excited.
One could say we're moving right along.
Oh, nice. Nicely done.
This guy, just everything he created, and like it was easy to take for granted, like Sesame Street, or like, yeah, I know what the Muppets are, but then everything that went into it. Before all of this, didn't know much about Jim Henson at all. Like, not that I didn't care, or not that I didn't know his name, but like just that, I don't know. I didn't know about his experimental film stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd ever seen. Well, I had obviously seen the stuff on Sesame Street and that kind of stuff, but I didn't realize, honestly, that was even him. Or that, that you could trace that back to his beginnings, and that he had all these other ambitions. And I would say here too, another thing to keep in mind as we go forward, because I think we're gonna have to deal with it as the series progresses, is that the guy just had all of this stuff happen, and then Justin like bounces from Sesame Street to like, oh, and now he's doing Vegas, and he decides that makes him want to do Broadway, and it's like this dude is juggling so much stuff, and he is a workaholic. Like,
I mean, I would argue that his workaholism killed him.
Yeah.
But he is not doing like Sesame Street and then Vegas and then Broadway. He's still doing he's still doing Sesame Street during all of this. He's still making appearances with the Muppets on other shows. This stuff's happening simultaneously. Yeah. He's like got the plates in the air, and he's the guy holding them all up, and it's really insane. When we get it to like, we'll get to it on the next episode, but when we get to the Muppet Show, he's bopping over to Europe and back and forth, and like just it's.
Pricon says he would stay up like days, not sleeping,
and a lot of this is due to his like need to that ticking clock that we keep talking about.
Yep.
You know?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what I'm thinking about is like he is constantly thinking about that. He's worried about also being boxed in. Like even with Sesame Street, like they get through that first season and then they could easily go into the second season. You know, he could just rely on that if he wanted to. And
But he wasn't satisfied doing that as
but
an
he couldn't-
artist.
Yeah, he
Like
didn't, that's not what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
Like, you know, or you know, not the only thing he ever wanted to be known for. And
Mhm.
he thought there could be so much more. Meanwhile, by the way, he has a family. He has 4
Yeah.
kids, I think, at
Yeah.
the point we're at now.
I think he's got 4
And
kids right now. Yeah.
he's got a wife, and their marriage is starting to get tumultuous like right here because
Yeah. I mean, well, I
know-
think we'll touch on that a little bit more on the next episode. But yeah, it's not that they were like didn't like each other. It's just that he's always away. I mean, his focus is on something else.
Yeah.
You know?
he's always it seems like pretty complex too. Like it's like he's always away, but Jane seems like she understands what he's doing. But
Yeah.
also she comes from that same world. They partnered together because she was also doing this thing. It was almost a 50-50 split between them.
And then she starts having kids and maybe starts feeling a little left out. And
yeah,
you know,
she starts feeling left out. It seems like, you know, you see it as they think of, especially Idea Man, that the kids start talking about, like, even at the dinner table, that like she wants to hear about like what's going on with the business, and he wants to be like, while I'm at home, I want to be like Family Guy, and
Yeah.
I want to
But
you
she's
to be
still-
wife, and there's a butting of heads there, and
Yeah.
so there's a struggle that they're starting to deal with. He's got a lot in the air he's dealing with,
Yeah.
and
It's a complicated guy, ambitious, complicated.
And I know if there's folks out there that have been listening to the show for a length of time, it can feel like I'm the contrarian a lot, or, you know, that I have very specific tastes or whatever. But like, you know, when I approach something that I'm either not a fan of or am not familiar with, I think I come to it through the research that we present here on the show. And even if it's still not my favorite, I have a better appreciation for it through the history and through all these details and through these behind the scenes looks and these personal stories that we get into here. And this is no different. It is glaringly obvious I'm a huge Muppets fan, as we all are. I think it would be safe to say we're all raised on it. But this is no different. Like, I'm learning so much about, you know, the man, the techniques, the engineering. You know, I struggle with time management and I'm on this podcast and trying to produce my other one, and I'm producing a comedy show and producing a D&D show, and I feel strapped for time. And then I look at the life of Jim Henson and I'm like, I'm going to go ahead and shut up. Like, it's, you know, so there's a lot there, but I'm learning so much about this, and it gives me a better appreciation for it maybe it's because I'm a little bit older or something. I'm looking at it beyond surface level.
I think that's all we got for this one, guys. I'm
Yeah.
excited to get to the next one because then that means the last 2 weeks I've watched a lot of Sesame Street. I've enjoyed it. My wife has really enjoyed it. She's a big Sesame Street fan and a big she, in addition to the giant animal tattoo on her knee, she also has a Big Bird tattoo. So she is.
Nice.
She says Big Bird was her first crush when she was a child. It was her
Aw,
first.
Good choice.
our listeners, I assume, you know, like there's these different versions of Sesame Street and that sort of thing, but I do sometimes think of like our listeners in other countries, or maybe younger listeners that I don't know, that didn't get as much Sesame Street. It feels like it's not the same thing as like with it being on like Max or something versus like when you watch it on public television regularly. There's like this weird, like, it was a part of my life, and
Yeah.
it's a part of my life.
It was a part of your life every day.
Yeah.
For a while.
and a part of it that I haven't revisited in a long time. And even on VHS, like when we get into them, like I had the Great Muppet Caper and the Muppets Take Manhattan, and I wore those tapes out,
Yeah.
and I have not watched them, you know, but it's been decades.
But it's
probably.
wild how like revisiting something that was such a pivotal part of your childhood could like it gets unlocked in your memory.
No, no, no.
almost.
That's
Like,
exactly where I
like
was going.
watching
100%.
Sesame Street. Like I haven't thought about Grover doing near far, like the thing where he runs to the camera. I haven't.
Yes.
I forgot that existed until I saw it. Then I was like, this was one of my favorites when I was a kid. I used to watch this one all the time. Like that was one of my favorite skits.
Super
and
Grover.
I would do it with my toys and stuff, and I forgot it existed until I saw it on YouTube.
Is Sesame Street, the Muppets, the Muppet movies, are they nostalgia proof?
They might be, honestly. Like if anything is.
Yeah.
I mean, in that like you're not viewing them through rose-colored glasses necessarily because they are genuinely still that good.
Yeah.
A lot of things you loved when you were a kid, you go back and watch them now and you're like, oh, this kind of sucks or whatever. If you could admit to yourself that they suck. A lot of people have the issue with like going and not watching them critically, but like, I don't know, going back and watching something like Sesame Street, maybe because Jim Henson also had the parents in mind and not just the kids, you watch it and you're like, man, this is still very entertaining for a show that's aimed at 4-year-olds.
I was gonna point that out, that I know that like what I'm excited about is going back, and especially on the movies, that there's gonna be stuff that like there was obviously like adult stuff happening, like adult plot that was happening that I didn't quite grasp. I was just watching the Muppets.
And the Muppet Show is, I mean, it's an adult oriented show. Not that there are like risque jokes or anything, but there are jokes that there are double entendres, and there are a lot of a lot of the guests aren't going to appeal to children, but it's still, kids would still enjoy it because there's puppets blowing up. It's still funny. Even if they don't get a lot of the jokes, there are things that they will find funny. So
it just made he made like something that could be like generational, or like just like span over all this time, like depending on whatever bracket you fall in, there's like something for you, which is pretty clever.
I just wondered, it's like, did Jim Henson crack the code? Like I'm not sure of anything else that has this kind of staying power. There's very few things I think that have this kind of staying power.
Yeah. Well, and another thing too that this just made me think of, not to just keep this podcast going for another 3 hours, but that one power that the Muppets still have that I will just keep, I guess I'm just going to hammer on it every fucking episode, but that just that they're there, like physically interacting with who they're with, like something about them. And we, you pointed out earlier, Justin, I think somehow they all have their own personalities, even when it was like a team of like 5 people. And it was like they all have their unique, like who they are. They feel real, and there's something like just magical and fascinating about seeing them, that like animated stuff, like CGI, like whatever, like nothing will ever capture. There's just something weird and fascinating about the Muppets that
they're like tactile,
you can't capture
like,
elsewhere.
They're and you can see the texture of the fuzz, the felt. And that, and you on a certain level, what that feels like.
Yeah.
So you can, I don't know, there's something about them that just feels, I don't know, real.
Yeah.
It's wild. And I'm very excited to do more. The same way that I watched a lot of Sesame Street this week, I'm going to be watching a lot of the Muppet Show, which I actually do anyway. I watch the Muppet Show pretty regularly because it's all on Disney Plus and I love it. Yeah. And we just throw that on like as background noise all the time. So
it's a good choice.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm excited to watch it and dive into the history of it because I honestly don't know. I know some about it, but I don't know a lot about it. So I'm excited to learn. Well, I think we've talked enough about the Muppets today. You guys want to tell our listeners where you can be found on the internet?
I am at This Is Gary Horn. You can find me on all the social medias under that name, bitching about whatever's going on with TikTok because it affects CapCut.
It's back today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then who knows? Will it be back tomorrow? Who knows? Yeah. By the time this episode comes out, who the hell knows where we'll be?
Yeah. My show, Computer Resume Podcast, covering the entire Star Trek franchise in chronological order, is available everywhere and at Computer Resume on all the socials and Patreon. If you like stand-up comedy or if you like Dungeons and Dragons, I host monthly comedy shows as well as an actual play called D's 20, performers and personalities playing Dungeons and Dragons live. And tickets are available on eventbrite.com, and I'm at Mr. Todd A. Davis on Facebook, Instagram, Letterboxd, and D&D Beyond, as long as they behave themselves.
Letterbox, huh?
Yeah, I'm way behind.
I am at Justin_Bishop on all the social media things. You can reach the show at cinema_shock. And also check out our episodes as well as links to our Discord, merch, etc. at cinemashock.net. You can also find a link on there to subscribe to Cinema Shock Plus, or just head to cinemashock.net/plus. And you can help support the show. Throw us a few bucks. You can also get extended episodes. You can get episodes early. You can get video episodes, all kinds of fun stuff at cinemashock.net/plus, as well as our Twin Peaks watch along, which we are wrapping up season 1, and then season 2 of Twin Peaks will be coming sometime in I don't know, in a few weeks, I guess, whenever we get to it.
Nice.
So, and then once we finish that, it's back to the world of David Lynch, which part 2 of David Lynch is going to feel very different than part 1.
Yeah.
Weird.
Jeez Louise.
Weird. So, until next time,
May the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
and be excellent to each other.
Johnny has the keys.
Was that
I tried to do Mana.
I was like, what song is that?
Johnny has the keys.
No,
Yeah, doesn't work.
Did not work.
Yeah.
You should have had us do like, mana, mana. Johnny has the keys.
Damn it.
Mana.